Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, it's been about a week and a half since our last episode, which, admittedly, sometimes it takes us a little over a week to put on another episode. That happens, but this is quite the week to be delayed. Now, fret not, we're here for the long haul, so this may be a little bit longer of an episode. It may be pushing that 3 hour mark. We'll see. But there is plenty of ground to cover, and I can't say I'm pleased to report because I'm not, but I will say this episode has come full circle because we're talking about
Hmm.
Syria again. Now we'll cover Ukraine first. We'll
Yeah,
get into that. We'll talk about the events leading up to the recent outbreak of fighting in Syria again. A little bit of European news, of course, and then maybe touch on some domestic news, get into some East Asia stuff, some Central Asia stuff. We'll see where things take us, but we definitely have to return to where the show started, which was in Syria. And
yeah.
I hate to say it, I'll elaborate further as we go on, but I think it was about 4 or 5 episodes ago we said that Syria might be the next target. They might be trying to reignite tensions there. And it looks like if trends continue,
Yeah.
it's only been a couple days, that may be the case. And like I said, I'll get into further detail about that and really flesh out my thoughts. But there's
And we
also been
were we
quite a
were
few.
the only ones we were the only ones in this sphere who said that.
Oh, yeah.
And and the only reason we could say something like that is because we're pessimists.
That is true. But I've never met a more optimistic pair of pessimists or more pessimistic pair of optimists. However you want to put it.
Yeah. You've never seen pessimists laugh so hard.
But with that being said, there's plenty to cover in Ukraine as well. So I'll hand it over to
Yes,
you if you're ready.
yes, and before we get into the battlefield report, I have some homework way back. I think maybe in October or September. I was talking about Iskander missiles being Soviet tech, and as you know, my arch nemesis Romanos corrected me in the DMs and said, "No, the Tochka U is, is Soviet era. Iskander is post-Soviet era. That was whose development began near the near the end of the Soviet Union, but it was not finalized until the fall of the Soviet Union. So he's yet right again. Anyways, I thought I'd mention that. Um, Now, on to the battlefields. Um, let's see. We can start with the first slide. The first slide basically shows some of the some of the Russian gains in the Zaporozhye region. There's been a very small advance. Um, we're going to talk about what is happening in Velika Novoselovka because, like many things since the last show, there have been a lot of surprises, and this is not the least of them. And one of the reasons there have been surprises, particularly for the Ukrainians, is because this front has been more or less static with some positional fighting. You can see that the Russians have made, various gains in the last few weeks, but uh, let's say it's not necessarily remarkable, right? Um, but it is because it had been quiet for so long that we saw a front open up in Novoselov, Velika Novoselovka. Uh, so let me just go back to the maps. But let's look at the gain that the Russians have made today. Um, this is in Belogorovka or Beloherovka or Biloherovka in Ukrainian. I can't. I find it difficult. Um, it's kind of unnatural because, like, where there is usually an O in Slavic languages, they have a long E, and I find it difficult. So I just revert to what I know.
I mean, a lot of these
Anyways,
Ukrainian names are just a series of hissing sounds.
oh my goodness. Okay, so the next slide is we've now moved eastward, and we're in the Velika Novoselovka area of the front, which is really the the middle ground. Let's say it's where Donetsk and Zaporozhye meet. Um, you can see that the gains here from the Russians uh, in the last 8 or 9 days, they're pretty massive. They are on the outskirts of Velika Novoselovka. They've captured an important farm and some larger buildings in the outskirts. Let's go to the next slide. That will give you a sort of a blow up image. I've circled with where Novoselovka is. Now, what has happened so far with the Russians is Novoselovka is a series of villages. It's cut into sectors. There's about 5 sectors cut up into parts by various rivers. These are not huge rivers, but rivers nonetheless. And I mean, the name of the place literally means like new villages or the new village, right? So at the moment, there was a road going from the north of Velika Novoselovka into Konstantinovka and from Konstantinovka into Pokrovsk, right? That now is essentially done with. And the slides will show you why. However, the Ukrainians have been better at stopping the Russians from the southwest side, as you can see. Now, when you study what they've done here, right? The yellow outline is basically what the Ukrainians have taken back from the Russians in the last week, and the pale green outline is the advances made by the Russians. Now, if you look at the little squiggle circle that I drew, that's Velika Novoselovka. Now, there is a highway that goes westward from there, and then it goes up. Essentially, what this means is it's going to take longer for resupply. The Russians also have hit some tanks that have been moved into this area, because the thing about Velika Novoselovka is that ever since the Kursk incursion, a lot of Ukraine's best forces are stuck in Kursk. However, in the last week, they have managed to stem the not the tide, but the rapidity with which the Russians have been advancing around Korohovka, which is just east and north of the area that we're looking at right now. Okay, and it's this move by the Ukrainians that I think gave the Russians an opportunity to move westward towards Novoselovka. And the reason it's important is it is a bit of a hub, but it is also the only large settlement, and it is not a large settlement, but it is the only settlement of any significance within 30 square kilometers in any direction. So you can see why it is important. Now, the settlement itself is in a low ground, and everything else around it in all 4 directions are on high ground. So it's not necessarily going to be like an easy place to keep. But, I think most people agree that Velika Novoselovka is going to fall. Now, you have some FAFO guys or NAFO guys that on Twitter that are saying now it's not important, but one of the leaders of the Azov 3rd Brigade actually said it's extremely important, because everything west of here is Zaporozhye, and like I said, it's a hub. It's a hub that the Russians could not take from the Ukrainians since 2022, though they tried, right? So. And this is also the area where the Ukrainians successfully pushed the Russians down, about 8 or 9 kilometers, 10 kilometers south, right, in this front. Essentially, what the Russians have done is they've recaptured about 60% of this year. So let's go to the little gain that the Russians have made, which is directly south of Velika Novoselovka. You can see there that they have the yellow outline is a few days ago the Ukrainians retook uh, Makaryevka, and the Russians now have moved, taking over some of the fortress lines in the woods, in those tree lines separating farm fields, and have moved, a little bit eastward.
And if I recall, this is what prompted Siersky to declare another counteroffensive. This small
Yeah,
gain.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they would have to choose like another area of the battlefield to really catch the Russians off by surprise, right?
Like
Like,
Idlib.
yes, like Idlib. Ah, that's very good. That's very good. So the next slide is north of here, which is still in the Velika Novoselovka Vremevsky Ledge salient. Okay, this is I believe is Rozdolivka. No, Rozdolne. So Rozdolne has been completely captured by the Russians, and you can see that there's a fortress, a big fortress complex, immediately to the left of it. Okay, that fort that those fortifications are bifurcated by a highway that leads directly into Velika Novoselovka, because Rozdolne is just north of Novoselovka. And it is this highway that links up with Konstantinovka, and from Konstantinovka links up with Pokrovsk, right? So just so people understand, the next slide is kind of a blow up of the area where the Russians are currently at. This is from yesterday. So this is the extent. The Russians now just have a toehold. They've also taken over, as you can see, the thing that looks like a bow tie on its side. Um, Major fortifications. So, and remember that everything in this area is quite flat, right? And there were tanks here belonging to the Ukrainians that were hit. Um, and that would mean that the Russian drone operators are close by. Now, one of the techniques that the Russians, began using, in Bakhmut was take over a place, but don't rush it. Get the Ukrainians at a point where they're constantly bringing in new men all the time, right? Because the Russians have an air force, right? And of course, there's going to be dead and wounded that will have to be moved out. But what the Russians will want to do is control, create all these little mini, highways of death, roads of death, where reinforcement and evacuation are always under threat. And we saw this play out in this year, way back in February with Avdiivka. And that's the other thing that they're working on doing right now. So if drone strikes are hitting Ukrainian tanks on counterattack measures, then that means like they've moved their drone operators closer to the front, and they intend to make it difficult to resupply this this complex of a village. So Velika Novoselovka also does not have any big industrial sector. It does not have high rises. It might have some buildings that are 2 or 3 stories high, but it's nothing like many of the other towns that we've been looking at. So next slide is again just it's to the north of this salient. It is immediately east of Rozdolny that we were talking about, and you can see it's this one little salient pushing up. Okay. This area is, remember I was talking about the highway going north. That is to the west of here. You can see it on the map. It goes towards Konstantinovka. The next slide gives you an overall picture of where all of this is taking place. So if we zoom back out, we can see where that new salient that just formed today and the taking over at Rozdolny took place. So let me see. Yeah, so Korahove is near the top right-hand corner. That's the with the long yellow line going left and right. Um, To go to the next slide, that basically tells you where everything is situated. So I've circled the salient that is formed that is about halfway between Korahove and Velika Novoselovka. You can see how tactically the Russians are trying to create two pockets in both areas. The Ukrainians will have to think about getting their men out. And for the Russians to create these salients that have big pockets, right? Like you need a lot of men. Now, it's generally presumed that in this area of the easternmost part of Zaporozhia and the southwestern part of Donetsk, that the ratio of men is 1 to 1. But Velika Novoselovka was guarded by mostly territorial units, and I believe one of the battalions belonging to the presidential brigade. I imagine that they're there to basically enforce the conscripts.
Yes, that's what it was. They had the territorial defense that was mobilized units, the presidential brigade to back it up, which uh, is a pretty accurate description of a lot of the Ukrainian front line these days, where it is largely staffed by conscripts with a little bit of muscle in the back. So,
Yes,
and don't we'll get into the conscription issue in once we get through our front line reports, because there's some pushes out of Washington in order to lower the conscription age, and
it's
like I said,
so
I'll get
disgusting.
uh,
Yeah,
trust me, I'll get into it.
yeah, yeah. So the this next slide is a blow up of the areas just south of Kurahove. The Russians have captured the other Ilinka. There are a lot of Ilinkas, okay? And like they're literally within 10 kilometers of each other. They don't even call it Nova Ilinka. It's just another Ilinka. There is, however, also a Nova Ilinka next to one of the other Ilinkas. So, anyways, so you can see that the Russians are closing in this area. This is where a lot of about 3 brigades of Ukraine's elite units were pushed into this front to stop or slow down the Russian advance. The Russians have basically taken Ilinka and Elizabetka, and now are threatening basically to get Veselny High and Hanivka. As you know, they're going to want to close this pocket that you're looking at, right? That blue bulge, they're going to want to snap that shut. And that's what's going to allow them to attack um, Kurahove from the south properly. So, next slide, we can see what's going on with Kurahove. You can see that the Russians have advanced well into the city. They've begun working and taking over more of the trenches. You can see to the north, they've expanded a little bit of their control. Um, this is where the other Ilinka is, and this is also just outside of Beretsky. Now, Beretsky, look, I'm going to tell you something really interesting. A little bit of Slavic history. So the Beresti tribe of Slavs moved into Macedonia over 1,000 years ago, and there is literally a place in Macedonia north of a town called Kichevo that's called Brest, and Bresti Orchid, or Hrid. Hrid is all Slavic for hill, and they moved, like part of them stayed and the other part moved back north into what's now Belarus and created the city Brest, which of course Beresti means elm tree. So anyways, I see these names and they're so familiar to me, these
And
words.
it is a pivotal city, the one in Belarus, because that's the one where they actually enforced one of the Orthodox unions with Rome in.
Yeah,
Would that I think that was the 1569 one? It might have
yeah,
been one of the other. I know there were like 3 of them, and that is where Russia signed the peace treaty to end World War I and ceded a third of their western territory.
yes, that's right. That's right. So next slide is basically it's a blow up of Korahove. And you can see that the Russians have now advanced definitely. They've gone over that river line. They are now definitely in the center of the city. But that salient that you see pushing in, south of that is an apartment complex, and west of that is an even bigger apartment complex. And then along the river line is where there's an industrial zone. I talked about this about 3 episodes back, but that is where they are right now. Next slide. You can see the area that the Russians have taken, moving ever westward, getting rid of that pocket. Yes, there it is. And then the next slide will give you an idea of how the front has changed around Pokrovsk. So you can see now that the Russians want to envelop Kursk from the south, which means it necessitates that they move further west. Yep. And then finally, we see a small salient where they've advanced just a little bit out of that area. There's a little blow up. And then we get to Toretsk, which is north of it. I'm gonna see why this. I think. Sorry, some of these images that I wonder if they okay. It looks like they worked. Okay, so the next image is the battlefield that is Toretsk, and we mentioned on the last show that there has been a lot of back and forth in this area. So this slide shows you the green outlines are outlines that the Russians have. The red outline is the gain. The Russians took over a hospital in a forest area. You can see that's outlined in red. The yellow is the areas where the Ukrainians have made counter incursions. Now, stop where you are right there. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, yeah, some of these just didn't load, Constantine. I'm sorry. I don't know what. Yes. Okay. So if you know what, let's just keep going. Don't worry about finding more maps. So that's Toretsk for you. Bakhmut, no big changes since last week. Um, we can then go into the Kupiansk area. That's the next slide. You can see almost all the gains here are by the Russians. They have reached the Oskal River, which is what you see at the top of this slide, and you can see more gains working. They want to expand this salient. They want to make it thicker and also reach the Oskal River and move down. The next slide shows you basically what they're doing. If you want to go to the next one, yep. And then finally, this one is a closer magnification of this area. Now, this next slide, I didn't get much into it, or I have brought it up, but this shows you the yellow outline is where the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians out. This is what I mean about like the Ukrainians in this area, the southern part of that whole, from Kupiansk to Svatove, Kremenaya. The Russians are in a slightly more advantageous position there, but in the south towards Liman, the Ukrainians are in a advantageous position, and you can see why, because Liman and the forest around it give them ample opportunities to hide all their drone operators. Incidentally, I caught up with some of the videos by History Legend, and it does seem the case that the Russians did capture, very unfortunate, they captured 9 drone operators, which they executed. But then also we have stories now that are emerging of Ukrainians, not just Ukrainians, but Georgians, French speakers, Ukrainians, Poles in Solidovo. Remember, the Russians took Solidovo way back in October, and they have found at least 2 dozen bodies. Like at least, yeah. In one area, they found 19 bodies. In another area, they found 5 bodies that belonged to a 91-year-old man. It was his son, his daughter-in-law, and their children that had been executed by them. Um, so yes, I mean, I bring this up just so people understand just how grisly and ugly this war is, and just the kind of vengeance and sense of revenge that permeates both sides. So
I,
let me
I
see
did want to
if
bring something up about the drone operators, and the comparison
yeah,
that everyone has been making is that they're treated the same as snipers were in World War II,
yes,
and
yes,
they
yes,
are viewed with the same level of contempt. And then also on top of that, I would argue it might be getting worse because some of the stories I actually heard out of the Donbass, there was an interesting interview on the Duran with Patrick Lancaster, and he
yeah,
has been doing on the ground reporting in the Donbass for years. And what he's saying right now is in some of these frontline cities, not only are they putting the so-called cope cages on the tanks, but they're putting them on civilian vehicles now because that's how bad the
yes.
drone problem is.
Yes, yes, because if there's one thing that both sides have is a ton of drones, like limitless drones. Like, you know, the incursions that the Russians made around Velika Novoselovka, the Ukrainians didn't have a lot of artillery, but they had almost a limitless supply of drones. Um, so that's something to think about. Um, sorry, I'm just okay. So let's move down to Kursk. So let's keep going. When we get to, I'm just going to get rid of I'm going to get rid of this map here because it's just going to confuse things for both of us. And so all we have is the Kursk map. So there it is. So here's an overview of Kursk. Kursk at its height had 900 square kilometers, and the Russians now are roughly at, I think, 500 or 450 square kilometers. So about Kursk, half the size of Kursk has been reduced. So what you're looking at is half or 45, it was 45% or 50% larger than what it is now. Next, you can see there's been a small incursions by the Russians northwest of Suja. I've outlined where Suja is in the next slide. Again, this is an area where I think we've already discussed on the show that many of the units are dispersed everywhere. We have stories of both Russian and Ukrainian units stuck in forest areas for days, surrounded. Sometimes they get out, sometimes they don't. And Kursk has been an area that has been very difficult to map out and figure out what is controlled and where is it being controlled, especially because, for the first 2 months, there were hardly any trenches that were built and whatnot. And, this, when we get to Syria, this will pop up again. Okay, so the last slide. Let's go and just take a look at that salient that was taken by the Russians. You can see it's still a ways away from Suja, but Sverdlikovo, Sverdlikovo is the next town, and before the Russians would mount an attack on Suja. And you brought up, for instance, that Syrski said that there would have to be, a new incursion somewhere, because Ukraine cannot just keep fighting a defensive battle. Um, where I mean, I know we joked off air. Yeah, it's Syria. I get it, but where do you think it would come to be? Because there was a story last week that I spoke about, and or the week before when Gio was on the show. I mentioned that there were some leaked military papers of the British government that came out, and it was actually not just them that were of course, trying to attack the Kerch Bridge and all that. But also, they're the ones who convinced the Ukrainians to go and try to hop over into Krinky. Remember Krinky? Remember
Oh
that
yeah,
battle?
yes.
And eventually it was abandoned. Um, that colossal waste of time. Yeah, that was them. But so okay, so Krinky's out of the question. Zaporozhye is kind of out of the question. Now we know the Russians have moved at least 5 special paratrooper brigades from the Zaporozhye and Kherson region to go fight in Kursk, including one Marine unit. And we've talked at length about the Ukrainians moving their special units, their well-trained NATO units into Kursk. But if they have to mount another incursion somewhere, where where would that be? Within the context of Ukraine.
Logically, I think it would have to be in the north.
Hmm.
And even then, it's still a stretch. I mean, there's the small pockets near Volchansk, which has been pretty stagnant for the past several weeks. And even that wouldn't be much of a counteroffensive in itself. I don't know, maybe in the Kupiansk direction, but I mean, there's not really much prospect otherwise. And I can see why they're pushing for the conscription drive, which once again I'll get into in a minute here. But it seems like the prospect of another counteroffensive is too little, too late. And maybe I'm not giving
Yeah.
the Ukrainians enough credit, or who knows? Maybe they'll uh, fake out Russia and go for a Belgorod offensive and have 2 incursions into Russia. I mean, I could see them being foolish enough to do something like that. I don't think it'll happen for practical reasons, but I could see that idea getting brought up in among the Ukrainian general staff. If we just do another incursion into Russia, that will break their back, or maybe Russia's economy will finally overheat and will collapse in on itself because the ruble is weak. Russia's economy is going to collapse. It's overheating, is what we've been hearing for several weeks now. Well, not several weeks, but the past couple weeks really picked up steam. But once again, I think that it would have to be around Kupiansk if we're going to talk about any sort of
Hmm.
counteroffensive, which that still seems just insane. I don't see the
The,
resources or the manpower for it.
yeah, and I think also you have to factor in the element of surprise. There's no surprise here. Like when they made the incursion into Krinky, the Russians knew that the Ukrainians would do this because they kept bombing the west side of the Dnieper River for months. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians persisted, lots of casualties, but they persisted, and they crossed the river and they entrenched themselves, and the Russians had a difficult time um, extracting them from there. But I feel like the only way this could work is they find an area without being detected where the Russian front line is sparse and they would have the element of surprise. I don't know. I mean, just 2 3 days ago, and they would need, HIMARS units. Now, an Iskander destroyed at least 2 HIMARS this week. Um, it's, this video footage, I would say it could be, but we know that the Ukrainians have lost several HIMARS units this year. So yeah, where is it going to come from, and are they confident about doing a winter offensive? You can see that the Russians, it's just an offensive. Like they went on the offensive in 2023 for Bakhmut, and everywhere else they were more or less stable and played the defensive role. In late 2023, in late October or mid October, I should say, the Russians made a go of it at Avdiivka, and in February it fell in the next year. But everything has been kind of like you don't push hard, and then your resupply lines become endangered, right? So I would say that the Russians have done this slow, steady approach, and this is why they've gained, nearly 2,000 square kilometers this year. Why they've finally started gaining territory the way they were gaining in 2022. Um, but it's going to be this. It's not going to be any big arrow movements from the Russians.
Maybe the Ukrainians will be insane enough to try to cross the river and take an again and take the Zaporozhye power plant.
I know they've tried that before, and that
And
place has hardly any water, and they would have to climb up the banks of that area. It would not be an easy fight. Like when there
no, I
was
agree.
water,
But
but it's possible, right?
they're running out of options. There's not much they can do.
They could have taken the Kursk nuclear power plant, but they didn't. They didn't want to.
Oh, how generous! How conciliatory of Zelensky and Syrski not to take the Kursk nuclear power plant.
Very civilized. The other bit of news is, of course, the Ukrainians have resorted back to attacking with ATACMS again. I guess we didn't deal with it. Did we deal with it on the show? The strikes by the Hazel missiles? I
No,
guess not.
we did not get into the Orezhniks. We did not get into the hazelnuts. That happened like the day after we recorded because we
Yes.
were talking about the potential of Ukraine using the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows in Kursk. That happened the day after we recorded, and then a day or two after that, you had the Orezhnik strike.
Yeah. Yes. And a pretty impressive strike. Now, as far as I understand, most of the sources, or at least half of them, say there were actually no munitions. That was all kinetic energy, and it was spooky how fast they looked, like impacting the ground. Right? They hit Dnepropetrovsk. Now, 2 days ago, the Ukrainians used ATACMS again in the Berdyansk area, which I think is technically in Zaporozhye near Tokmach. But they also hit Novakhovka in the Kherson and killed 4 civilians there. I don't know how many they killed in Zaporozhye, in the Bryansk area. But I'm more aware of they hit a bus, or hit the street, and the bus was badly damaged, and I mean they killed a child and 3 seniors. It's like, I don't know what to say. It's like it's a very static area of the front, and we've said it before on the show. Like when things aren't going well for Ukraine, they lash out against civilians, and really this is no different. It's just another example. So it remains to be seen, what are the Russians going to do now? Are they going to put armaments, conventional armaments, but basically in a missile that is traveling 3 kilometers a second?
That that does remain to be seen, and as we saw with this test, that they're more or less capable of evading any air defenses that Ukraine or even I would say all of NATO has at this point. And
Yeah,
this brought up the question within NATO: how would we be able to defend ourselves against a Russian attack? And that was the question that constantly came up. That I think they said our air defenses could last something along the lines of 3 months before they were exhausted. And of course, this had to do with the response to the use of the long range missiles in Kursk into Russia proper. And Russia had said that was going to be if the Western powers were to collaborate with these strikes with Ukraine into Russia proper, which I know that with the annexation of the Oblast, that technically is Russian territory, but with the actual red line Russia has drawn and not the red line that has been said that they've drawn, that has they've said that they were going to respond and that they said they reserved the right. And now what they're talking about is they say that they are going to target NATO command centers. Now they were intentionally vague. They did not say whether that was going to be in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine. However, my thought on the whole thing is if Russia were to escalate, obviously lobbing missiles into say Poland or Germany or the UK isn't going to accomplish anything. I don't think anyone would have expected that. Anyone with a realistic view of this war would have
yeah.
expected that. But what my initial thought is, we have seen an increase on strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, is that they were just going to eviscerate the power grid and leave Europe to pick up the pieces.
And
And
actually, in the last 48 hours, that is what they've been doing. And they've been particularly focusing in on Western Ukraine, Lvov, Vinnytsia, Lutsk,
Grovno is another one.
Rovno. Yes. So they've taken out at least two power stations. We know Odessa has been hit, but Odessa is a city now without power and moving into the winter. So yeah, I think the Russians will do that, and if anything, they're going to give more missile technology to Iran and the resistance forces and Yemen. We know, like,
Uh,
if Yemen has hypersonic missiles, Iran does.
oh, of
So
course. And now that the front is picking up in Syria, we'll probably see an increased arms shipments to Syria again. But
yeah,
also on top of that, with Russia's response of saying they're going to hit NATO command centers, we already saw that with that one Canadian officer. I think his last name was Kent, or that was either his first name. We were talking about this earlier. You'd said something about me, where and this has happened throughout the war, yes, but I do think one of the next moves that they're going to take is that they're just going to start open season liquidating any NATO officers or personnel within Ukraine, and that they're not going to hold back on that anymore. And that was, let me see what that man's name was who, quote unquote,
this was
suddenly
confirmed
died.
today.
Yes, this was a Canadian officer who, quote unquote, suddenly died. Kent Miller, who was a
Yes,
trainer of the Ukrainian armed forces, and it was believed that he was probably killed on a strike on a mercenary base, and this was released on November 25th that they had hit the military base that he was allegedly at in Kharkov. And like I said, the Canadians have finally acknowledged, the Western press has finally acknowledged that this Canadian lieutenant colonel was taken out. And like I said, we've seen isolated cases of this before where NATO officers, and in fact, especially Canadian officers. I remember the fall of Mariupol saw the uh, disappearance of the Canadian general who, let's just say, had a controversial history just to keep things clean on the air, and he was never seen again. And there have been strikes on some NATO command centers within Ukraine. But when it comes to the escalation, when it comes to them moving into a quote unquote state of war with Western powers or with NATO countries, it's going to be those kind of actions. Like I said, there's nothing to be accomplished by lobbing missiles at Germany, and the Germans trying to set up these bomb shelters in metro stations. It's all fear mongering. It's all bloviating,
yes,
and
it
the
is.
response of NATO top brass saying, "Well, the businesses are going to need to prepare for wartime conditions." Like I said, it's all bloviating because the
After 3 years, now you're preparing.
well, okay, number one, if the Russians were to make any incursions into NATO, it would be the Baltic states. It would just be because that would be the easiest they could probably with relative ease. I'm not gonna say it'd be easy, but with relative ease compared to the rest of NATO, they could sweep that front. Maybe some incursions in the Poland via Kaliningrad and Belarus. Or, I mean, but granted, if there was going to be any outbreak on that sector, it would be on the initiative of the Poles trying to go into Belarus. And we've seen murmurs of this since the beginning of the war. Uh, so, but the idea that Russia is going to attack into
I
NATO
don't.
territory
Yeah,
is just simply not going to happen
it's not.
unless NATO has a preemptive response, like they were floating that NATO is a defensive alliance, and we need to consider how to perform a decapitation strike if war does break out with Russia. Like I said, all the
I mean,
regular
they
talking
were
heads.
even hinting at first strike.
Yes, yes, that's what I'm referring to, where they're saying, "Oh, well, we
Yeah.
can't just sit around and wait for the Russians to strike us. Where even though we're a defensive alliance, we would need to be able to take the first action." But once again, the West is simply not interested in getting embroiled into this war, and although they're more than willing to send the Ukrainians to do, while they're more than willing to depopulate Ukraine and destroy it, whatever prospects it had of being a nation, they themselves simply realize they are not capable of both maintaining political legitimacy, maintaining power, and entering into a modern industrial war. The two are mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Now the Ukrainians, since the last show, of course, they've launched many attacks, but mostly in the south towards Rostov, Crimea, and so on and so on, right? And this is the one thing I've always found peculiar by Putin, saying that attacking Russia in the north is a red line, but not in the south. Like, I mean, Crimea has been a part of Russia for 10 and a half years, and to be honest, like for nearly 2 years, the French, the British, and the Americans have been launching missiles in this area, in the south, for nearly 2 years. So, I mean, that's Russia, and of course, one of Russia's biggest central military command centers is in Rostov, right? Now, attacks have been done on Rostov. I don't think and that's Russia proper. That's not like post 2014 or post 2022 Russia, right? So, I find it weird that he decided that that would be the red line. It almost makes me think that the Russians, for a long time, have wanted to demonstrate their Oreshnik missiles, and now they have. Um, I imagine because the last few days of attack strikes have been largely very ineffective, and these are always accompanied by drones as well. And as I mentioned earlier, mostly in the south, but not confined only to the south, but also in the north. However, I would think that the Russians are going to retaliate again with the Oreshniks, and probably this time they will have munitions on them. But they're quite content to just use the Iskanders, which have proven to be very, very effective, right?
Yes, and one thing
Uh,
I'll add about the Orezhnik strike is that a day before it happened, right after they authorized the Ukrainians to use the Attackams and the Storm Shadows, and eventually the Scalps, even though they still don't have permission to use the Taurus, the Germans are holding out. Election year, we'll see what that happens
yeah,
in the winter. But there was the evacuation of several Western embassies in Kiev a day before this happened. The U.S. withdrew several personnel. The Italians withdrew. I
that's
believe
right.
the British and French also withdrew. But point being
Yep.
is, many of their strong Western backers recalled diplomatic personnel, and probably, and this wouldn't be publicly announced because they're not officially there, probably withdrew quite a bit of military personnel as well before these strikes happened because they knew it would provoke this response. And my thoughts on this are I don't think they're convinced that lobbing some Western missiles into Russia proper is going to be enough to lead to a crisis in confidence and collapse Putler's government or cause some sort of economic
No.
crisis. But once again, it's all about international image. If they can provoke the Russians once again into lobbing an Orezhnik on a Western embassy that is fully staffed, are they still going to win the support of India and Brazil or even China at that point? And that, I
Hmm.
think, has been, when it comes to the so called escalation ladder, the rationale at which the West has approached a lot of their actions, where if we get the Russians to escalate to a certain point, it will become unpalatable for their partners who are teetering on the edge. Now, I think that their logic is flawed going into it, but it'll
Yeah.
be unpalatable for, say, a country like India or Brazil or, I don't know, say Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, whoever it might be. Any of these, mid to major sized powers who are helping Russia avoid the sanctions and haven't compromised their economic activity at all. And they're hoping. I think India is the big prize with that, especially. And
Yeah,
and
but
they're
I have a doubt about Brazil is another matter
yes,
because America controls South America so well and for so long. They have a lot of contacts there. Uh, I can't see India persuaded. And okay, so the reason I can't is uh, India and China, and we don't even have to mention Iran, know that there would be retaliation for the years that they did support Russia should they turn against Russia. Number two, even if there wasn't retaliation, and Russia would balkanize because of brave Ukraine and Putler being ousted. Um, like they're never going to like these two big major powers and centers of commerce, which have been really growing and emerging in the last 10 years. They they are not. They're going to be economically strangled. Uh, like the point of Russian resources is that they're under American control and they're dispersed in a judicious way that put America first and maybe Europe second. But it would not be to the benefit of India or China in any imaginable way. So I imagine as the war goes on, both of these two major powers are going to entrench themselves even more. Um, yeah, I mean that's just the way I see it. It's too late for that
Oh,
now.
I
There's
completely
too much
agree
at
that
stake.
you're not going to
What
peel.
would BRICS be if it was under American control? It wouldn't even exist.
You're not going. The Americans are not going to be able to dissolve BRICS, and even with the India-China issue, that has been completely smoothed over. That was smoothed over before the BRICS summit, and
Yes.
I don't know at this point what the Russians could do to make them quote unquote unpalatable to say their other partners in the world. I just don't think there's anything right there, even just from a pragmatic standpoint, as you were saying, especially China, major industrial economy. Look at how much energy they import from Russia. Look at how much oil and gas they import from Russia. Sure, they get plane from Iran. Sure, they have deals with other Central Asian nations, but the Russians are they dominate the market in that regard, and it's hard to dislodge them. It's hard to replace them. The Europeans have learned that lesson full well. That it's not easy to replace vast amounts of Russian energy resources that can be obtained for relatively cheaply. In fact, it's just worse because you have to pay a premium through India, Egypt, or Saudi Arabia at a certain point, or even China at that point. And the once again, the rationale of the West is if we get the Russians to do something stupid enough, they'll diplomatically isolate themselves. But we still haven't seen that happen because number one, the Russians haven't really taken the bait. I would say their escalation has been in kind. It has been on par. It hasn't been anything drastic. And number two, all the pragmatic circumstances that we had just laid out there.
Yeah, and they're not swaying the Russian public either. Um, that's mainly why they want to increase Ukrainian attacks. They're not going to take out air bases that they can't reach. These Oreshnik missiles that were launched from a distance that no ATACMS is going to reach them anyways before liftoff. So, and we already mentioned how fast they would travel. That there's no chance that they're going to knock them down. The only thing maybe worth considering is how many Russia has of these, but you can well imagine that production of Oreshniks is only going to increase right now. The other thing to remember is intermediate missiles of this type were the most popular missiles during the Cold War. So basically, Russia's going back to this. Now, of
And
course, we have to remember that Trump got rid of the ICBM treaty
yes, I
in
was just about to say
2019.
the INF treaty. I was just about to bring that
Yeah,
up.
the
That
INF, yes.
the Russians have carte blanche to produce those because they're no longer treaty bound not to, and that Trump repealed it, said he was going to get a replacement, and then couldn't get the Chinese to agree because that was allegedly his big concern about that. And now the Russians, especially with the outbreak of the war, have full license to produce really any of these weapon systems. And something else I'll add because you mentioned the Russian public. With that, the West has also burned any bridges that have the Russian public because number one, the sympathetic elements left at the beginning of the war, or the ones that didn't leave, so far have been gradually realizing that as much as they might dislike Putin or as much as they might dislike the way Russian politics are run, it's better to side with my own than side with people who are openly musing about the destruction of my country.
Yeah, yeah. They're not gonna flip them. The other thing
Much
to
like the
keep in mind,
Iranians, there's a lot of
yes,
elements in Iran that probably would like to see a regime change, but because of the absolute belligerent rhetoric of the West, better the mullahs than having my country turn to ash.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it also goes to show you just that the wars are never accidental. They take years to prepare, and Trump getting rid of the INF treaty was the first step. Besides, providing Ukraine with lethal aid, wars are planned years in advance, and that's what we're living through right now.
Yes, and I am not eager to see the wars that are being planned right now because I can only imagine it's going to be much further escalation with anything, say, in East Asia, whether that be China, Taiwan, or an outbreak between the two Koreas, or any potential conflict within the Asia Pacific theater, and especially the Middle East. I hate to see what is happening with that, with the new escalation that we just saw in Syria as well. But with all that being said, I suppose the last story I have about Ukraine is that in one of Biden's final public acts, the bitter, spiteful old man that he is, the I look, I know I've joked and I've done the quote unquote ironic Biden support thing, and that it was funny. Okay, and there are a lot of things where you could make the joke about Biden as the accelerationist candidate, or perhaps America deserves a senile president. And like I said, or you know what, even in his dementia, there's still the slightest bit of charm. Which, well, no, you know what, I agree with that. Out of all the Democrats, out of all the prominent Democrats, Joe Biden still, in his demented mental state, is the most charming. I fully admit that. However, when we get down to brass tacks, when we look at what the man actually does and actually represents, he has been a wicked and depraved man even when he was of completely sound mind. I mean, look no further than, say, the 1990s. And he was the one who was one of the big supporters of the interventions in the Balkans, and in fact was going as far as to say, well, we've seen from this past century the Europeans can't govern themselves, so we have to move even more resources in there. And that was also in the context of the Yugoslav wars. And now, as one of his two final public acts is he authorized the ATACMS, and now he is leaning on Kiev to lower the conscription age from 25. They already lowered it down from 27, from 25 to 18. Now, mind
It's
you,
pathetic.
plenty of Ukrainians have been illegally conscripted, underage, not fit for service. There's been plenty of that happening. But now they would officiate conscripting 18-year-olds. And I can tell you, if they're officiating that with the level of graft and corruption, if it's legal to conscript an 18-year-old, then they will illegally conscript 16 and 17-year-olds. It will happen. It's
Yes,
probably
and
already happening to some degree, but it will become normal to illegally conscript minors. And Ukraine will likely resort to child soldiers before they accept any sort of negotiation. And look, I know that there's the big elephant in the room of Donald Trump, and what is he going to do? And I think there is a lot to be said in both directions. I'm not optimistic. Don't get me wrong. I'm not optimistic. I think there's quite a bit to be said in both directions. But what I've seen so far does not make me optimistic, and I'm under no reason. I'm under no illusion to believe that Donald Trump or anyone on his team would step in to stop the lowering of the conscription age, because what the statements were today is that Trump is going to threaten to withhold aid to Ukraine until they agree to negotiations, and then, I don't know, make some sort of equivalent threat to Russia. And if either side disagrees, the arms flow is going to go to Ukraine. I mean, look at what um, that blubbering clown Sebastian
how
Gorka.
how is that going to persuade
N-
Ukraine?
yeah,
Quit the war, or I won't send you weapons. But if Russia doesn't stop, then I will send you weapons. Like,
yeah,
I mean,
it's and
it's
you
so
you
stupid.
had that bloviating clown Sebastian Gorka, who is now one of the quote unquote counterterrorism experts within the Trump administration, who, mind you, has been a triple agent for several governments throughout his life. He actually had his security clearance revoked by the Hungarians. I remember that he was in with the Orban government, and then he got exposed as pretty much an MI6 double agent. And then he started working with the American intelligence, and he was also in the Trump administration briefly the first time, but he was saying, "Oh, the aid we're going to give to Ukraine is going to look like peanuts. The aid that Biden gave to Ukraine is going to look like peanuts compared to what we're going to give them." Well, what more can you give Ukraine at this point? What does the West
Hmm.
have in its arsenals that can turn the tide of the war?
Why is this happening? I mean, for every dead Ukrainian, there's like 5 dead Russian soldiers. Like, I don't understand. Remember that in June, Putin actually said, because we've been familiar with, you know, idiots like, what's his name? The gay Republican guy.
Grinnell. Is that
No, the other gay guy.
Lindsey
The other
Graham?
gay, Lindsey Graham, the other gay
That
Republican.
doesn't narrow it down.
He's been hankering for like well, I'm sure he hankers for 18-year-old boys, but
At
he's
least.
but I mean but I mean for war. He's publicly stated this, that Ukraine needs to it already got lowered last year from 27 to 25, so now they're going to go for 18. And remember, the reason why they wanted 27 and older, and as you say, there were illegals, right? Illegal conscription, right? Um, but the reason they did it in the first place, or they tried to stick to 27 and older, is because Ukraine has a demographic bottleneck, and
Let me just get
um,
the population pyramid. I'll pull that up.
yeah,
But do continue.
yeah. So they've been trying to avoid this, because literally, if they start killing off like teenage boys and very young men in their early 20s, right? That's it, right? Like, I think it's so cynical. It also demonstrates that the West is just, it's too chicken. I know you hear Macron this week talking about we have to send in troops. Blah. And we've been here
Well,
before.
and the only reason he's saying that is because his newly formed government could collapse under a vote of no confidence if their budget doesn't pass.
Yeah.
And that is the only reason. Right now, I'm just looking for the population pyramid, just so I can give you guys a comparison of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. I found one. I just got to get the right file type in order to get this. But uh, Starmer backed out when they had these talks. Those talks lasted for all of, say, 2 days before they decided that it's simply untenable that Western troops are not going to be sent to Ukraine, that these so-called Western peacekeeping forces are not going to be able to accomplish anything. And I really don't know what the end game is at this point, because so far Western countries have blown more of their credibility making these rapidly belligerent threats they will not back up than ceding, I don't know, say, the Black Sea coastline to Russia from Ukraine would have. Okay, it would have been far less embarrassing for Western nations had Ukraine been forced into a humiliating peace 2 months into this war than whatever the hell we're looking at right now.
Yeah.
But once I'll get this population pyramid up because it's very telling, and it's just a matter of finding an image file that'll actually work. And I mean, this is something I should just keep on hand, but here we are. So, but ultimately, I am skeptical whether or not it will go through. I'm not sure because public sentiment towards the war in Ukraine is already,
It's shifting.
yes,
The
rapidly.
majority now want a deal, even if it means losing land. Only about 30 to 35% are saying no.
And we did read that article on the election day episode that we did do, where a lot of them do want it both ways, where we want to maintain all the territory, but also do it diplomatically. And
Hmm.
obviously, you're going to get people who have that uh, contradictory mindset. That is bound to happen. But I do think when push comes to shove, a lot of them wouldn't care if the Donbass was ceded or if any of the eastern territories were ceded, if it meant them not dying, their family not dying, life being able to return back to some kind of normal. And that's another question. What does life in Ukraine look like post war? What is there? I don't know even what to say. Where even a victory will be a defeat because there's going to be nothing left there. There's going to be no opportunity. Any opportunity that is left is going to be swept up by the same class of people who staged the Maidan. And right here, here is the population pyramid as of 2023. And once again, you can see this gap in military age men, this 20 to 35 gap, where it is right there. And as we've been talking about before, there has been a large amount of older men who have been conscripted, where it was around the front line, the time where the average age was 42, and you had a lot of the older men who were mobilized. And you can see right here in some of these areas with the excess women population on the right-hand side in the red here. So this is, once again, this is supposed to be in the shape of a pyramid. That is what a healthy population looks like. But it's not even inversed. I don't even know how you describe the shape, and I don't mean to laugh, but the situation, there's nothing left for this country. Even in the event of victory, there's simply nothing left for this country. It is so bad that people within Ukraine proper, within the quote unquote free Ukraine, are returning to the occupied territories due to a lack of economic and social opportunity. They're choosing to return to their homes in Russia that are now a safe distance away from the front line and going back to live in these places in Zaporozhye and the Donbass and Kherson and wherever else that might be, because there's simply nothing there. And once again, I will always recommend, if you want just a microcosm of what's happening on the ground in Russian occupied Ukraine, go to videos from Mariupol. It's just a guy who lives there, who makes
Yeah,
videos about the reconstruction of the city, and it's not just, oh, the Russians completely turned things around. He talks about, yeah, there was some people who got screwed over out of their property that they had for a number of years. The cost has gone up in some regards. A very honest assessment of what life looks like in occupied Russia, and compared to what it looks like in free Ukraine, I don't think it's a contest. Not at all.
yeah, yeah. I mean, at this point, really, it's just about the major investments that companies like BlackRock, but also BP Oil, there's many others that made these investments into, for Ukraine. And I mean, that's all that this country is going to be. Now, interestingly, like that is basically what the Americans wanted for Russia, right? The idea was like, we're going to come in, we're going to buy all the industry, all the resources are going to be ours, but don't worry, we know what a good lifestyle is, and we're going to supply that for you. You're going to have great services, et cetera, right? Now, when the Americans invaded Iraq over lies, they went even more whole hog in that approach than they did in Russia. And it's largely the same thing for Ukraine. Even if there was no war, Ukraine would be bought up by Western interests, right? Because let's say that happened, right? Well, America would never stop moving eastward. And that's why then the center of finance has to migrate along with the border, right? And and of course, if and when Russia does finally fall and balkanize, and that center will continue to move. But like I said, the whole point of it was that they would push like their sort of concept of negative freedom, freedom of the individual, a service-based industry, but the other hard industries, and they would be moved off somewhere else. But resource industry, well, they would own that. Russia used to pay like BP money, like they would get like 5%, and they would pay them money like to rent out the space. It was just
Well, I
ridiculous,
know I've been
right?
bringing him up a lot, but once again, one of the big scandals with Rex Tillerson when he was appointed Secretary of State is that he had oil interests in Russia.
Hmm, hmm.
And once again, a Western oilman who was exploiting Russian oil fields. And I mean that in the quite literal sense, like, of exploiting oil fields. And I'm sure the business arrangements were probably lopsided post Cold War, but just using, I just want to clarify how I was using that term.
Yeah.
But you're right in that if this did not happen, it just would have been the gradual encroachment eastward that the Americans would spend more of their resources, energy, and population towards this dream of global empire that really may, and I would argue that even its benefit to the elites, of course they benefit. A lot of them have made a fortune off this. Look no further than the American ruling class, but even then, a lot of them are just obsessed with reshaping the world in their own image, no matter what the cost, and that they will expend money for power, so to speak, and that they will uh, expend money in order to accomplish their great goals of having some sort of I don't know, the Fukuyama dream of the end of history where the entire world is a liberal democracy. And by liberal democracy, we mean regimes that agree with us and our interests and that answer our every call. That the entire world will be ruled by Yeltsins who answer every demand from Washington. And, I mean, this war has been a travesty. Don't get me wrong, in every sense of the word, but it was also inevitable because, and I do, and you can call me a Russian shill, you can call me whatever. I sincerely believe that the Russians, before acting in 2022, did exhaust every diplomatic option at their disposal before resorting to this. And like I said, you can think what you can disagree with me, but I sincerely believe that. And with all else failing, I think in many ways they had no choice but to act. And like I said, I don't like that it turned out this way. Arguably, even the 2022 status quo, where they, I don't know, forced the peace treaty, the draft peace treaty that they had, would have been better. But uh, just for the sake of people's lives and livelihoods. But at a certain point, it was going to be where if not just Russia, but if you encroach on any regional or great power enough that has the ability to resist, you're going to cause a war. And they decided it would be worth paying that cost at the ever so slim chance of degrading the Russians rather than leaving them to their sphere. Leaving them to, I don't know, let's just say for the sake of argument, the former Soviet Union. And they decided it was worth that the quest for power, the quest for reshaping the world in their own image, was worth what Ukraine looks like today. And many Ukrainians, for a variety of reasons, also agreed with that. And I'll say this. I know I was talking to you the other day about this, where at this point, and I've been sympathetic to this position for a while. Uh, I think that every military-age Ukrainian man uh, should be able to apply for asylum in the West. I don't care. The only exception I would make is if you're some Bandrite keyboard warrior, you can stay. Okay, you can eat your own words and you can live up to your own principles. That's the only exception I would make for something like
Hmm.
that. But just the average Ukrainian man, ages 18 to I don't know 45. I think that's the conscription age range they want right now. Uh, should be able to get asylum in the West. And you know what? I know places like Poland have had some problems, Ireland to a lesser extent, but by and large, a lot of the Ukrainians in the West have been very non-intrusive. And the worst you can say is that they've been a little insufferable with the diaspora nationalism. But most of them have been functional members of whatever country they assimilate into. And like I said, I've talked about this before. There's actually a rather long-standing Ukrainian diaspora community near me, and of course, with the war, they had a recent influx of new arrivals because a lot of them had extended family, whatever. And just being in the diaspora community, it was easier to resettle them there. And like I said, aside from you kind of want to roll your eyes whenever they, indulge in whatever Ukrainian nationalist mythos gets brought up. They're completely functional members of society. You don't feel unsafe being in their neighborhoods after dark. Is my point. And they deserve refuge, in my opinion, way more than anyone from, say, Afghanistan. And I'll wholeheartedly stand by that. And but still, we're taking in Afghans, we're taking in Pakistanis, we're taking in people from countries that aren't even at war, like Algerians. But once again, you'll get these sob stories in the UK about, oh, we're deporting this Afghan criminal who ran a grooming gang. I don't know if I can say that, in which case I didn't say that if it's not allowed. But we're also drawing up plans to deport military-age Ukrainian men to die in an unwinnable war, and that's the logic of these Western countries. It is, and once again, this has never been about being pro-Ukraine. This has been about Ukraine is the nearest convenient battering ram. They are the nearest convenient, uh, I don't know, cannon fodder, I suppose we could put it. And that, in a way, as much as they despise the Russians, I don't think many of them are going to take the time to make the distinction between different Slavic, especially East Slavic groups. And if they're engaged in a brutal war against each other, that's all the better for all they care. And just that Russia's the quote unquote bigger threat, so we'll support Ukraine. And once again, a lot of them probably relish in the fact that Ukraine is also going to destroy itself in the process, because outside of Russia is the largest country in Europe. Population-wise, it still has a large industrial base, still has a lot of resources. So I think at a certain point they would love for Ukraine to ravage itself, take Russia down a peg, and then swoop in like the vultures they are, and extract whatever they can from Ukraine. And that was the plan from 1993 onwards. Once again, we can go back to George Soros, we can go back to
Hmm.
all of that. That is what these people want to do. And once again, you can think whatever you will about the Russians, about the Slavs, whatever your personal prejudices are. But sure enough, if they can, they will do it to your nation as well. They will do it to every nation. These people do not care. Like I said, they are a rootless class of people who want to reshape their world in their own depraved image. And while they might despise some people more than others, they'll do it to your nation like they do it to Russia, like they do it to Ukraine, like they do it to Iraq or Iran or whatever designs they have for the Middle East. And if your nation has something to offer, if your nation has something to extract, they will, if you do not fork it over, they will try to extract it forcefully. And
Hmm.
these are the people who are running the world right now. I don't think there's really any other way to put it.
Yes, I mean, of course, I concur with everything that you've said. The Telegraph, just to briefly revisit the topic of lowering the conscription age, they interviewed one of these conscription officers that hunts down young men. I mean,
Oh
they're
yes, let
really
me get
they're
that article headline back up.
yeah. I sent you just a photo of it from the
Yeah,
Telegraph,
I got it
but
right here. I'm a Ukrainian conscription officer. People hate me, but I'm doing the right thing. Uh,
yeah,
Subtitle:
okay, buddy.
Recruitment officers are painted as brutal kidnappers going to take extreme measures to reach their monthly quota of new military recruits. And once again, we saw this very heavily at the beginning of the war. Now that the situation has grown more desperate, they are less discriminatory. But they conscripted from the east. They conscripted from the far west of Hungarians and Rusins and Romanians. Anyone who was not of that Western Ukrainian stock were the first ones to fight and die. And of course, there were some of them who were rabid enough nationalists to openly volunteer for that. But once again, it was an ethnically driven conscription drive. Uh, and in many ways, this war has been a civil war for that reason, because the bulk of the men to this day who have been fighting in this war have been the Russian speakers from the center and the east of the country, the people who under normal circumstances, probably would have maybe not viewed themselves as Russian, but at least had some kinship. They weren't like these people sitting in Lvov who denounced the Russians as the Asiatic hordes. These people probably have family in Russia. With the shared history of this region, whether that was under the Empire, Soviet Union, whatever, uh, this these lands have been under the same leadership. These lands have been under the same polity for more or less 3 centuries. So once again, people are going to move around. People are going to intermarry, and that I think it's something like what is it? 1/4 of the residents of Moscow have some sort of relative in Ukraine,
Yeah, they do.
and I'm sure that applies
I
to.
mean, every time I've gone, like I meet somebody who, oh, my grandmother's Ukrainian, oh, my uncle's Ukrainian, yeah, oh, like a lot.
And the joke I heard the other day, and perhaps this is adding too much brevity to a heavy situation, but you look at a lot of what's been happening in the Ukraine war. It's the Ukrainian ultranationalist with the Russian name, and it's the Russian irredentist with the Ukrainian surname.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's crazy. Yeah, I mean the reason they would tell me that is because, of course, my Russian is actually not that great, and I speak it with like a Balkan accent, which to them, for some reason, they'll tell you like it sounds like a mix of Old Church Slavonic and Ukrainian. So that's why they, especially like,
And
sometimes you're speaking for days
your
and days and you start
appearance,
reverting. What's that?
I said your appearance. I've seen you.
Yes.
I could see how conclusions can be drawn.
Yeah. So, yeah. So yeah, they that's how I found out. But yeah, you would be surprised. A lot of them, they'll have like surnames that are most definitely like Ukrainian surnames.
And one of the big arguments I made, and obviously it turned out to be wrong, about why I thought this war wouldn't happen is I thought there was too many family ties between the two countries in order for them to properly fight, and I didn't think that they were in a position to have a civil war. And I was expecting when this war first broke out, and I've discussed this then. I discussed it in retrospect, and like I said, I'll fully admit I was wrong. Is that the Ukrainians, who would be the bulk of the fighting force in Ukraine, like I said, the ones from central and eastern Ukraine, who are either neutral to pro Russia, simply would not engage in a war against the people they saw as brother people or co-ethnics. And like I said, I was wrong about that, but that was my rationale going into this. And I do think that is probably the rationale of many of them right now, especially many of them who have dodged conscription, whether they have gone east or west. Where
Yeah.
I do think while a lot of people have quote unquote rallied around the flag in Ukraine, either by force or otherwise, uh, I still think a significant chunk of the Ukrainian population, judging by the amount of conscription dodging, judging by the amount of people who've left the country, um, it do still view this as a brother war that they want no part in.
Right. And I think, maybe we could add a few more layers of nuance, and that is, you know, we saw it that at the beginning of the war, and it was, the invasion itself that I think for a lot of these Ukrainians in central Ukraine that were maybe undecided or might have, not had any strong feelings against Russia, might have changed because of, the rapidity of the attack, and like, which was meant to frighten the Ukrainians into making certain decisions and so on. But that was, I think, because I said when the war started that this would, divide and galvanize people, right? More so than 2014. For one, the scale is so much larger than 2014. The current war that we're in. But I would also say, remember how even from the beginning, especially in the first half of 2022, when it was the Russians that were making, like, first of all, nobody in this war gained as much territory than the Russians in the first half of 2022.
With that being said,
It,
it does have its biases in the direction that you'd expect, but I watched a video the other night documenting the first 1,000 days of the war by Bingov Battleground. Like I said, take it with a grain of salt. It has all of the things you would expect from a quote unquote neutral commentator. But overall, it's a pretty good view of what has happened on the front line for the past 1,000 days.
yeah, yeah. So I would say that remember that in the spring of 2022, we mentioned many times that there were like large numbers of Ukrainians who surrendered. Also, Ukrainians that were killed either by Polish mercenaries or by the elite neo-Nazi units. One of the reasons a lot of these guys from eastern and central Ukraine do fight is because their fate, if they don't, is worse. So, like, I think that plays a role in it because essentially what you have is older middle-aged guys from central Ukraine and slightly east Ukraine that are under the command of young men, very nationalist. Uh, Often they look very athletic, very capable.
All the NATO trained guys.
All the NATO trained guys, right? Like definitely like 35 and under. And those guys, many of them are from Western Ukraine. Remember the Kherson offensive? How I don't believe everybody of that 10,000 that got killed were all Rusins or Hungarians. I don't. I think a lot
No,
of them.
no, but
These were the guys from Vinnytsia, Lvov, Ivano-Frankovsk, those regions, right? Um, Zhytomyr and so on, right? That have always been like strong Ukrainian identity, and that's the dynamic that we're looking at is this younger nationalist Western Ukraine versus Central Eastern Ukraine, older guys. In that article by the Telegraph, he even mentions like I'll read you this part. Quote, sometimes it's like dealing with a cornered rat. When you shove them into the car, they keep resisting. Those who resist always threaten to take revenge on our guys or their families. Now, I should mention that did happen. So one of the first conscriptors was killed in broad daylight in Ukraine this week. And also a munitions depot in Odessa by, I guess, people sympathetic to Russia or just want the war to end, was also blown up. But anyways, Artem says anonymously, we have a specific target for how many people we need to recruit, and we no longer choose who to stop. Everyone is fair game. I used to avoid those who looked weak, but now I don't. I learned to control my emotions while working, and now it's just a job for me. I have always an argument. It's either them or me. He's
no.
doing the right thing, but it's either them or me. Like, which one is it, dude? The other funny thing is, uh, for the Kursk offensive, the Ukrainians are kind of running out of, some of the lower level guys that they have to keep in the trenches. Because remember, and we've talked on the show many times about um, active defense, where you have not well trained guys, the guys who are going to die in a week or two on the front lines, and then the Russians go in and invade these trenches, and then the counterstrike is always by these young, well trained, NATO trained units. Um, so you can so some of these TCC officers have actually been pushed into the trenches in Kursk, in the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. So he thinks it's better them than me, but like his day will come too.
Oh, well, for all of them. And one other thing I wanted to add in this topic conversation regarding the split loyalties of people in central and eastern Ukraine is I think that one of the biggest mistakes of the war for the Russians was they entered a lot of territory with little to no resistance, where many of the people thought that it's finally happening. It's like Crimea, we're going to be reunited with the Russians. And then the Russians tell them, we're just here to force negotiations. And what conclusion are they left to come to?
Yeah,
You're going to leave, we're going to be collaborators, and we're going to die on your behalf.
yeah,
And that embittered, I think, a large amount of the population against the Russians. Not entirely, but more than should have had to happen in the first place.
yeah,
And we saw that exact situation play out when a lot of these areas were withdrawn from. these people were inevitably labeled collaborators for something as simple as continuing a civil service job or taking food aid. And of course, the Ukrainian nationalists, they used Telegram, they used all of this to dox these people, to uh, expose them, to put their addresses and personal information out there. Many of them were disappeared, never to be seen again. And I think that is one of the. And now, at the very least, the Russians did allow these people who wanted to evacuate with them.
Yeah.
So that was one thing at least. They didn't just completely leave them to the wolves. And one of the big problems also on the frontline towns is when you have these because you always hear about the pre-war populations, but the people who refuse to evacuate, you can only assume are sympathetic to the Russians. So the Ukrainians act with complete disregard to their lives, and that's actually been where a lot of the civilian casualties have come from in this war. Now, this war has had remarkably few civilian casualties, especially compared to, say, Gaza and Lebanon, but that's not to downplay it at all. And I do think it's becoming worse. I do think this is becoming more of an embittered war, and that you will see more civilian casualties. You
Yeah.
will see more extrajudicial executions, and that until some sort of long-lasting solution is reached, this enmity is simply going to exist. And while this war at one point may have been solved diplomatically, and while I do think it will technically be solved diplomatically, uh, this war necessitates a decisive victor. And it's either going to be the Russians or going to be World War III. It's just that simple. The Ukrainians are not going to be able to take a decisive victory without direct Western intervention.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were ever going to be able to not to, but any pretense of them being able to is completely gone. And um, like I said, while I have said since the beginning of this war, I just want it to end. I just want things to. I don't want these people to die. I don't want anyone to die, especially not two large European Christian nations. I don't take any pleasure in this at all.
Hmm. Hmm.
But looking at this, and I hate to say it, the peace is only going to come through victory one way or another. And we all know what the conditions of victory are for both sides and which one's more likely to achieve that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's all I had for this. If you want to go into some brief European news before moving into
Sure, let's do
Syria.
that, and then yeah, we'll focus on
Um,
Syria and the Middle East
so,
afterwards.
big shakeup in Romania.
Yeah.
Uh, an anti-establishment dark horse candidate has come out of nowhere, quote unquote, pro-Russian candidate Călin Georgescu clinched a victory in the first round of the Romanian elections, and once again, it was the normal spread of what you expect in a European election. You have the center right party, you have the Social Democrats, the center left party, uh, the fringe nationalist parties. You have like 6 or 7 of them. Of course, I exaggerate, but still. And then once again, you have all the special interest parties who are either the Green Party on, say, environmental issues, or I don't know, maybe that's giving the Green parties too much credit these days. You always had the ethnic minority parties like the Hungarian Party, uh, but Georgescu came out of nowhere and clinched victory in the first round. Now this was after I, I cannot remember her name at the moment; it escapes me. But there was another Romanian nationalist candidate who was barred from running in the presidential election, and he filled the vacuum that she left. And many of the people who maybe weren't even sympathetic to her politically, but because of the ban, they rallied around her successor, as it were, which was Georgescu. And what the second round will look like, I don't know. As we see in these 2 round elections, much like we saw in France, when you have somebody like this come out of nowhere and clinch an anti-establishment victory, but not reach the threshold in order to secure victory, all of the other parties, left, center, right, whatever, form a coalition to defeat this candidate. That's what happened in France this past year. That's kind of what happened in the UK. Not that reform was ever that potent of a force. And that's what is looking like it's going to happen in Germany, where you're going to have a gobbledygook coalition to keep the AFD out of power, assuming they don't get banned from the elections outright. But in Romania, we saw it happen. We saw this candidate who nobody expected. He simply was not in the polls. And once again, polls are dubious in major democracies, quote unquote democracies, like the United States, the UK, whatever. To think that they would be any better in, say, a country like Romania, no, not trying to disparage the Romanians, but once again, when it comes to polling data and accuracy, I doubt that much is being uh, put in there because people simply just don't put that much stock into it. And he holds all the typical positions you'd expect: Eurosceptic, anti-migrant, not even necessarily pro-Russia, despite what the media says, but skeptical of supporting Ukraine and more inclined towards peace or a ceasefire. Much in the same vein as, say, somebody like Orban. Uh, I can't recall, but I think he has the token pro-Israel position as well. Like I said, everything that you expect from these kind of candidates. Even though like I said, I think in Europe the biggest issue is, biggest two issues are migration and Ukraine. If you can get it right on both of those, you have my support. If you want to stop the flow of mass migration, that's good. If you, not even pro Russia, but if you just want to stop funding Ukraine's destruction, encourage them to go into this war, stop arming Ukraine, stifle any NATO efforts to escalate this war, that's what's important. I think those are the two big issues in Europe right now, and especially when it comes to European peace, stability, economically, socially, otherwise. Those are the two issues that need to be addressed. I would say they're actually of equal importance. I wouldn't say one takes precedent of the other. I'd say they are certainly of equal importance. Now, like I said, the pro-Israel thing could come over to screw these people in the long term, which is a fear of mine. But once again, it is, despite my opinions on Israel, I think it's very much a secondary issue compared to the other two. And like I said, I don't think I need to clarify. I don't think I'm going to have many people accusing me of running cover for Israel right now. But I think, given the circumstances, you have to work with what you can get. And let's be honest, Romania's support to Israel is not going to change the tide of politics in the Middle East. But their position towards Ukraine, being a bordering NATO state, is much more important. But
Mm.
I am pleased to see these results, and I'm not optimistic, however, that he's going to be able to get a round two victory. But we'll see. We'll keep our eye on that.
Right.
Uh, but I know we'd already discussed the question of storm shadows and also the European contingent being deployed to Ukraine with Macron and Starmer. That didn't go anywhere. The French are possibly, as I had mentioned earlier, Le Pen might have the ability to force a vote of no confidence in Macron if the French budget fails, which would lead them back to another parliamentary election. Uh, in Macron's lame duck term, mind you. So the Frankenstein coalition they put together in the French parliament might not hold. Keir Starmer's popularity rating is just going through the floor right now. It's rather it's been less than 6 months since the election, and once again, it looks like another general election could be forced in the UK conceivably within the next year. Germany, as we mentioned, you have a general election coming up, which looks to favor the Social Democrats. Now, don't get your hopes up because, excuse me, looks to favor the Christian Democrats, but don't get your hopes up because Merz, who is the leader of the Christian Democrats right now, is everything that you expect. He is the center-right establishment, pro-Ukraine. I guess will talk somewhat of a game against migration, but ultimately cave to the same interests. And I don't know, maybe a bit more pro-energy, and we'll ship in some LNG from the United States, which will still not solve our energy crisis, which will still not boon up our industrial sector, but it'll make us feel good.
Yes. Uh, yeah, I mean, you're really seeing some of the panic now of various European leaders, regarding the situation with energy costs. There's just no way around it. You cannot, like, there just isn't enough gas and oil for to support the kind of industry in Europe at a price that's comparable to other manufacturing centers around the planet. And this is why you're seeing Volkswagen for the first time closing down factories in Germany. Uh, Audi is doing it. Of course, they're part of the same conglomerate. I don't know if BMW, but I think Mercedes has also cut back. And they're moving their plants to China, and of course, some of them are moving them to the U.S. as well. But it's basically over. And
And this is also on top of the push for electric vehicles, which requires them to overhaul their entire business model as well.
yeah, you know, Trump wanted to bring back manufacturing to America, but it was Biden who delivered.
And,
And that's
and there actually has been this major cope, right, that goes around in a lot of circles that, well, you see, Germany's economy is collapsing because they relied too much on cheap Russian energy. Where
what does that even mean? Like
that's why I've been trying
it
to
is
figure.
what it is. Like that, you have to survive.
Like, Germany's
Yeah.
entire economic model worked because of cheap Russian energy. And look, I have nothing against nuclear power. I think if implemented right, it's a perfect source of energy. I think it was stupid for the Germans to shut it down. But let's not kid ourselves. For an industrial sector, on top of energy, when it comes to, you need petrochemicals, you need all of that. You need oil and natural gas. Even if your electric grid runs entirely on nuclear, you need oil and natural gas to run an industrial economy. And even if Germany kept the plants on, uh, once again, if they didn't shut them down after Fukushima, but everything else played out the same, Ukraine war, Nord Stream blows up, Germany's industrial economy would look exactly the same right now. Look no further than France, which is having its similar industrial woes right now because they do not have access to cheap oil and gas anymore. Like I said, nuclear, fine source energy, great to keep your power grid on, but it does not uphold an industrial economy the same way oil and natural gas does. It's simply a necessity if you want
Yeah.
that kind of economy. But with all that being said, once again, uh, we're supposed to blame the Germans for the fact that they got their pipeline blown up. Is really what this argument really boils down to.
It's sick. It is so sick. Uh, like everybody knows America did this. Like this idea that Ukrainians did it. Like, come on, like get real. Um, I mean, I'm sure Ukrainians volunteered to help in one way or another, but the idea that Ukrainians masterminded this, using the minnow, get real. It's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, but real. The only way Germany survives this is if they get that cheap flow of energy from somewhere, anywhere. And you know what the easiest option for that is? It's Russia. It's repairing the Nord Stream pipelines and it's piping in that gas from Russia once again, despite
Hmm.
the complaints, despite whatever. But with that being said, the joke I've seen going around this week is that, of course, with Russia's the speculation that Russia's economy is just on the brink of collapse. What we need to do, because the sanctions have failed to cripple Russia so far, so we need to issue a truly devastating economic blow by letting Russia into the European Union.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
hilarious.
like I said, that's been the joke going around for the past few days, which I
Yes, it's
can't get enough
brilliant.
of. But it's funny because that's what this war is really over. Not that I think Russia would have ever joined the European Union, but this war was about severing European-Russian relations in many ways. And some might argue that
Yeah.
was actually the primary goal of this war, and that I think it was actually McGregor who said in one of the earlier interviews, this war is about Russia's relationship with Germany, and Ukraine is just the proxy. And
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
wouldn't say that's
Hmm.
entirely the case, but I think that is one of the primary reasons this war was waged. The fact that they did not want a robust economic relationship. Any other issues set aside, they did not want a robust economic relationship between continental Europe and Russia because it would form its own power block. And once again, as it stands, just objectively speaking, because of access to resources, because of industrial economy, if you can combine European expertise, especially Western European expertise, in precise industrial sectors with abundant Russian resources, you have an economic powerhouse that can rival the United States and China. And that's something they simply do not want. But What was the option that we went with instead? Coupling Russia and China. So, but you know what? At least the old world can't govern itself, and at least the old world is still under our thumb. Which I think for many in the Atlanticist camp on both sides of the Atlantic, they do fear a return of quote unquote old world values. So this is a victory in and of itself.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a major concern because especially after World War II, the West has really pushed forward this idea, of negative freedom, the individual. We've talked about this many times, particularly in the early years of the show, about it's the essential, it's the civic religion of the West, particularly America. But there are outliers like Germany. Never really had a kind of a liberal ideology that placed the individual above the group. Whereas of course Britain and America did, and to a lesser extent the French, but it's not the case the further east you go.
No, no, and these ideas developed within a certain context. The reason why liberalism was in the British Isles was a response to particularly the religious tensions. And of course, that got carried over into North America. Um, France, like you said, is a unique case, but it was never a universal idea. And you read the writing of some of, I don't know, let's just say John Locke, because he's the real standard bearer of all of this.
Yeah.
It was never intended to be some sort of universal ideology. And you even look at, yeah, you might, some people, and I understand, maybe see the Constitution as a dead document that doesn't mean anything. But once again, just to use it as an example, it was a governing charter for a certain people under certain circumstances. And these are things, once again, that uh, liberalism in particular, being a very particular ideology applied to particular circumstances, has become a universal expectation by many in the West.
Hmm.
And they will to return to some of my earlier points, they will simply not rest until that is the case. And they don't care how much money it costs them, they don't care what they have to expend to do that. That is the kind of world that they want to see. But speaking of returning to early roots of the show, do you want to talk about Syria?
Yeah, yeah, let's do that.
So we do have to preface this, however, with the ceasefire in Lebanon. So that was earlier in this week. Biden came out and announced that he managed to secure a ceasefire between Israel, Hezbollah, and the Lebanese military proper. And it was to go in effect on Wednesday, and it did. And then we see Wednesday night, Syrian time, into today. We're recording as of Thursday. This episode should be out Friday afternoon. That the Syrian rebels, with the full throated backing of Turkey, have launched an offensive in the Idlib direction towards Aleppo. Now, it was a rapid advance at first. This front had been static for a number of years, and a lot of the action in Syria that has been taking place was in eastern Syria near the Iraq border and southeastern Syria near the Jordanian border, where we had particularly the assassination of Syrian military and intelligence officers. But while you have had for the past several months, and in fact the past couple years, constant talks between Russia and Turkey to de escalate the situation in Syria and work towards some sort of peace agreement with Turkey waffling back and forth as we expect, they have completely reversed course and are pushing into Syria right now. And that is also joined in with one of their own assaults on SDF positions, which they've had skirmishes with the SDF for a number of years, as you know, but they have been sustaining strikes on SDF positions once again in northern Syria. And that there were some alarmists and there were some people who were rather eager to see things. Let's just say Jihadi Julian was excited to take up his old mantle again, and he was ecstatic that there was an offensive against the Syrian government in the Aleppo direction. Now, Aleppo, once again, that was one of the major battles in 2016 2017. Uh, I'm sure you'll recall it was a major talking point in the 2016 election, and that's not just because the libertarian pothead who couldn't figure out what Aleppo was, although that was part of it. But I remember that particularly on a more serious note, the Clinton campaign were talking about the Syrian war crimes in Aleppo, and that we
Oh
need to
yeah.
intervene there. And that was one of the big pushes of the Clinton campaign, pretty much on foreign policy, was that, and it was Russian interference, going all the way back to 2016. But the Battle of Aleppo, and the city was more or less secured by the end of 2016. I remember it was a massive PR victory. The fact that they were able to put it, this city that had been under uh, Islamic terrorist occupation for a number of years was able to have an open public Christmas celebration because, once again, Syria, one of the few countries in the Middle East that actually has a sizable Christian population, especially in the northwest of the country along the coastline. And Aleppo is one of those areas. And I think actually the two the bishops, one of them was from uh, the Antiochian Orthodox Church, and the other one was from one of the other Christian churches. I can't remember which one. I think like maybe like the Syriac Church, whatever it was. Point being is like that's actually I think yeah they were actually both bishops of Aleppo, and they were held hostage for a number of years. And I actually believe they still are right now. But Aleppo was one of the big PR victories for the Assad government, and we're now seeing the evacuation of civilians from Aleppo. Now, there was a massive offensive, but that seems to have been halted by the Syrian army and its allies, and that you are getting a counteroffensive to push back these forces. And once again, this was because Hezbollah is actually manning a lot of these, a lot of areas throughout the front line in Syria, especially in the northern sector, in that area. And you'll recall that from, say, 2018 onwards, that you had a number of Israeli strikes almost on a weekly basis after the U.S. Had done their strikes in April of 2018, and they were hitting a lot of Hezbollah positions, their ammo dumps, their command centers, and now that their capabilities have been severely degraded by the recent bout of violence with Israel, the Syrian rebels were able to take on another offensive. And I mean, I'll get into the details of the ceasefire and who I think the winner and the loser was between them. I think it was quite literally a stalemate between both of them, which is the reason why they ceased fighting. Because look, Hezbollah didn't gain anything, but Israel, I would say, also took embarrassing losses. All things considered, it was no 2006, but once again, this should have been a much easier victory for Israel, objectively speaking. But returning to Syria, what we saw was, like I said, something you haven't seen since, I don't know, say 2018, 2019, because especially in that front of the sector, where it was just the countdown to Idlib. I'm sure those of you who are long enough viewers of the show remember my probably my most embarrassing prediction I've ever made, which was the last summer of Idlib, and that it was going to fall, and that the Syrians were actually going to go in and end this last pocket of resistance. But no, Idlib is still standing, and now it's the site of the Syrians launching a counteroffensive. And I don't think it will succeed, but when it does return to a point that we had made about a month ago, where Syria was on the table when it came to Israel's escalation ladder, when it came to their greater proxy war against the Iranians. Syria was on the table for twofold.
Hmm.
Twofold.
Hmm.
Because, of course, it would bog down the Iranians, it would escalate the conflict in that regard, and it would distract the Russians. It would require them to move resources. And we've seen Russian and Syrian air units in the air launching counterattacks on these positions. But unlike Ukraine, the Syrian rebels do not have air defenses, not even from Israel. The Ukrainian rebels, Ukrainian, and they might as well be Ukrainian. Let's be honest. And there actually is some speculation. I would need to see more evidence that many of the rebels received combat training from Ukrainians. Like I said, that is only speculation. But the Syrian rebels were sitting ducks, that they had no air defenses, and that not even primitive ones. So I do think, especially now that Russia has revamped its military industry in the past 2.5 years, we could very well see the possibility where they do split their attention and actually dedicate resources and manpower and support to the Syrians to end this last pocket of resistance. And I think a large, they were trying to do that diplomatically with Turkey, as we saw over the past several years. But Turkey, once again, did support this offensive. Now, I'm not saying diplomacy is completely off the table. We've seen this song and dance a number of times, but I do think now that the Russian military industrial complex is a force to be reckoned with again. Maintaining both of these fronts, especially if Ukraine does wind down within the next year, is entirely possible.
Yeah, I mean, we should mention that over the last, I guess it's been at least 24 hours since this offensive. There have been some special Russian forces who have been there that have died. Now, I, I haven't seen a body yet, but I have seen one automatic or assault rifle, let's say, of a Russian kind that's advanced. It's not like the typical Kalashnikovs that you see, right? There are videos of the Syrian Arab army like essentially running away, and some of the Telegram channels are saying, "Look at them, they did it again. They're abandoning their positions while the Russians are holding on and fighting." I'm going to continue just to talk about like some of the intricacies of all of this. Now, um, the Turks have been actually firing directly on SAA positions, including reaching the outskirts of some of those strikes in the outskirts of Aleppo. Um, the forces are not yet quite in Aleppo as of now, and they captured something like 25 strong points and villages. Let me find a map for you that I can send you, because just as this show got started and a little bit before it did, um, a major counteroffensive by the Syrians
Yeah,
and
I found the live UA map. I'm going to go ahead and put that up. And that
okay,
has been,
great.
for once again, those longtime viewers, they'll recall that the live UA map has been the go to for Syria. It's been um, strikingly less accurate for Ukraine, but it's always been a good resource on Syria. So I'll go ahead
Yeah,
and pull that up right now. So you can continue while I get that.
yeah. So I mean, there's also rumors that the 25th Division soldiers that are stationed in Palmyra are expecting an attack by ISIS, right? Notice how ISIS always coordinates with Tahrir al-Sham. So I would say that, okay, yes, this was a major incursion. Now, geographically, it's not that big. However, it could become big. On the other hand, the Syrians and the Russians working together have recaptured two or three of the villages already, right? So why did this happen? Well, part of it is a lot of these fighters that were there are not there, and those are the fighters for Hezbollah, right? Remember that before the peace deal was reached, a second attack hit the property of Benjamin Netanyahu. Another Israeli military base was struck as well. Hezbollah launched over 300 drones and another amount of missiles I don't know. They did kill some civilians in Tel Aviv. And now we should mention that this peace deal, the so-called peace deal, has a kind of a frame around it that the Israel is only going to move out of these areas very gradually, right? And it will consider it will resume attacks if they if Hezbollah or any adversary in Lebanon attacks them, etc., etc. But the thing is, it's not working, right? Like you could argue that Benjamin Netanyahu has been making Beirut look like Gaza. The same kind of bombs have been dropped there. You know, those bombs and those gliding bombs and missiles that strike at a certain vantage point of a building, causing the whole thing to collapse. You'll see the videos look identical to what we saw this year and last year happening in Gaza. So why is he moving out? Well, I mean, I think part of it is, you know, we didn't get into the weeds of it and all the maps and everything. Part of it is because all the maps I could find are just not very aesthetic. They're very hard to read. You know what I mean? Like the colors aren't as contrasty enough. Like I will say that the maps for Ukraine are very easy to
Yes.
understand right away, and they're not in this area. How and of course I did wonder how long Israel was capable of staying in southern Lebanon. We discussed in the show, you know, you have these two extremes. You have the one where they invaded, what was it, 1980, 1981, and they're there for nearly 20 years. And then you have another one where they're, you know, they go into southern Lebanon for like 4 weeks or 3 weeks, and that's it. They leave. I think one of the things, and so this is somewhere in the middle. They've been there for several months, and it made we don't know if they're going to leave completely. We don't know if Netanyahu is going to lie because he is a liar. I mean, I think that's obvious now. But they
Maybe
have
he'll
asked for
have the ICC warrant enforced, and maybe that's the plan to get rid of him.
yeah, yeah. You know, France has decided that not to arrest him. That there's some special clause or whatever. But they would arrest Putler, right?
Oh, of course.
Can you put that picture that I sent you, the shadow of Putler, over
Oh,
Europe? I just
oh yes.
from political. This literally
Yeah,
came out last
the
week.
Politica one. Oh,
It's just wonderful. I love
I,
this.
did I add this? Oh, yes, I did. I like how they already seeded the Baltic states.
Yes, is it his forehead or his nose? His nose has joined Russia proper with Kaliningrad or something. I don't know, but
This is the real clips. They told you about it earlier in the year. You're looking at it.
it's so ridiculous. I love the fear mongering, but um, uh, I mean, it's a typical kind of lame Western propaganda. So anyway, so why leave? Well, I mean, on some level, it's not working, right? They didn't manage to cut off a southern chunk of Lebanon the way they did with Gaza by reaching the Mediterranean. Um, I don't know if we're ever going to know the exact amount, but I bet we're going to get a better idea about how many Merkava tanks were destroyed. I did see footage of a Merkava tank definitely being destroyed. And also remember that Gaza's not done. Gaza's not finished. It's out of the news, but not finished. And I mean, I still see all kinds of atrocities that are done by the Israelis. And as long as we're talking about atrocities, we should mention that you know, Israeli Jews went into an Orthodox church in southern Lebanon and took down icons and just, you know, desecrated them and um,
It looked exactly
make
like what ISIS or HTS would have done.
right. Isn't that interesting, right? Like they're so similar. You know, jihadi fundamentalists and Israeli Jews really cut from the same cloth. I mean, when you think of terrorist attacks, it's. I swear these two groups are working together in Europe. In any case, you notice how any other Muslim group in you know in Syria and Lebanon, they don't treat Christians like this.
No, and
Like
I'll add this as and I've made my thoughts I think on Islam very clear over the years. But once again, I will be honest. I will be objective that when it comes to Islamic Christian relations, yes, there is something in Islamic law that does dictate yes, Christians are going to be second class citizens, but it
yes,
doesn't call for their wholesale slaughter. And
right, or
like I said, I'm not
desecrating the
justifying it, but once it's
yeah.
not something where they have to just wipe these people out. Now, as we've seen with ISIS and some of the other sects, yeah, yes, that does happen. But just to return to your point, that yeah, a lot of these Salafist groups in particular, and the Zionists, it's the exact same behavior.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like I mean, you can look at so-called Western art of the 20th century and how the desecrated crosses, and you can find out the names of these people who did that. You can find out who funded this artwork. It's a similar kind of thing. Anyways, um, these animals it basically made like sexual gesticulations with the. It's just disgusting.
And they've been trying
Like,
to drive Armenians out of the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem, which far predates the state of Israel, mind you. This we're talking. This has been here for centuries. This Armenian quarter
yeah,
in Jerusalem have been trying to drive them out. I remember there was the case. I think it was actually before the outbreak of tensions, pre-October 7th, 2023, where there is it's this one Catholic church that is under the custody of the French government, and you had
yes,
the Israelis
yes.
trying to forcibly enter it as well, against the wishes of, I believe it was actually French military personnel there.
Yeah,
And
and
once again,
Macron was there when it
yeah,
happened.
it
They,
is
they, they did it literally to just humiliate Macron.
it is legally a piece of French territory, that one church, and they did that, as you said, to humiliate Macron and the
Yeah.
French nation as a whole, in my opinion, and probably just Christian civilization as a whole, if we're being honest.
Yeah, and, it's funny because, like, I'm sorry to say it, but like a lot of American conservatards, they're like, for them the only Christianity that exists is like, whatever, goofy branch of late stage Protestantism, and like they don't even count these others as Christians. Like, that's how conceited they are.
I'll
And
say what I've said many times before. As far as the American Empire is concerned, there's only two forms of Christianity, and that is your church either flies a rainbow flag or an Israeli flag, preferably both.
yeah, right. So, like, it's pathetic. And they've been this way even before those two flags were raised on church grounds. But like, um,
It's only
eh,
gotten worse.
yeah, it's only gotten worse. Thank goodness that at least their younger members don't like the Israelis.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I know that we've probably said some inflammatory things towards the Catholics over our 6 years on the show, but to their credit, even the position of Rome has been unwavering towards the question of Zionism, and that even the current Pope Francis, or for those of you who might not recognize the legitimacy, because there might be a few of you out there. I know that there's that one. I don't know what are they, the Catholics who think that the
The sort of a
yeah,
contest.
yes, that's what they are. Bergoglio, if you prefer. Like I said, to his credit, he has been pretty unwavering on the question of Zionism. And like I said, you can say he's waffled on Russia and Ukraine, where he has made some pretty pro-Ukraine statements, but also has walked them back. But I
Hmm.
don't think the man has ever made a pro-Israel statement.
Yeah, not that I know of. I mean, but in any case, like, I just thought that was particularly disgusting of them because, like, why? I mean, literally, Israeli Jews need Christians to fib on Shia Muslims. Like, that's how it works. But they can't even honor that. That's how pathetic they are.
No, no, and like, don't get me wrong.
They're just a pathetic people.
Uh,
Literally a pathetic people.
I mean, look, like I said, not to defend the Israeli state in any capacity, but they had that sense of pragmatism in the 70s and 80s where they made some concessions to
Yeah.
the Lebanese Catholic militias. Now, they also stabbed in the back at every turn. Let's not forget that, and that they also did everything they could to sell them out, even before the war
Yes,
was finished.
and they do that with the Kurds as well.
Yes,
That's
but they weren't
hilarious.
as brazen enough to go in and desecrate their churches while they need them as, let's just say, assets. And
Mm,
uh,
hmm.
yeah, once again, and it's I don't even think you need to be quote unquote pro Hezbollah to realize this, where uh, this country gets away with behavior that no other country ever could, and
Yes.
that yeah, they forced this ceasefire, but they couldn't help doing that one last thing out of spite. And let me remind you, on top of all of this, once again, it has been a position of the Likud party for years to try to arrange the expulsion of Palestinians to Europe. They have been planning this for a number of years. In fact, there was actually post October 7th, I think it was a few months afterwards, where they were in negotiation with Turkey to expel Palestinians to northern Cyprus. And it's no matter what, they will always find a place. It's your problem. You have to deal with them. Netanyahu's own son, I remember, was talking about this a number of years ago. Now I know he doesn't have an official government role, but once again, we're talking about the prime minister's son, who was presumably in his ear when it comes to a number of issues, talking about, well, because the Muslims used to rule Spain, all the Palestinians should be expelled to Spain.
Yeah,
It's
give me a
like,
break.
and you can tell like there's the certain nations that they have a particular amount of animosity towards. There's
Yeah, yeah.
Russia
You
and
know why
Spain
they
in
hate the
particular, and
Spanish? Because they
yeah,
kicked them out.
yeah, exactly. And like even with the contentious German history of the Germans, they don't have that level of contempt for the Germans. Even I don't know, maybe because the Germans are too obedient. Uh, who
It could
knows?
be also like
Oh, the
who
Poles are
gives
another
us.
one that they have this just the
Yes,
just completely,
yes.
and Poland was once Paradisus Judaeorum, and that's the thanks they get.
There, this year. I love that you're adorable. Oh, you're good. You're good.
Yeah. What was that? What was that old saying from the Commonwealth? It was a heaven for the nobility, hell for the peasantry, and paradise for the Jews. You see, you got to wait until after the 2 hour mark when you start saying these things.
But
That's
by the way, I should say, what's the Patrick Henry's YouTube channel? Church of the Logos.
that sounds right.
Yeah, he did a banger video a few days ago. Um, he looked at a book titled Russia before in prophecy and before the apocalypse. Words to that effect. And very, very insightful 3 hour stream. Interestingly, I typed in the title of the book and I found out that there was that Freedom Radio did an article where there was a church where a scuffle had taken place between the clergy and a soldier that had returned from the front line. The church had not done a funeral because a lot of these guys in Western Ukraine, you know, they're not in the worst situation. As we said, there have been exceptions, of course. In any case, a fight broke out in West at a Western Ukrainian church that was Orthodox, and they were booted out. Um, the clergy was, and they found several books, and one of them was this book. Yes, this book has excerpts and I don't want the channel to get in trouble, but you know,
Yeah, yes, but I'll take your word for it. Like I said,
yeah,
watch your mouth. But we are after the 2 hour mark, so we can make the more controversial comments. Because pretty much it's anything like after an hour you're good, and then after 2 hours it's like they're even the automated systems aren't gonna like sit there. But if you start just saying all this stuff, like if you do this all like within the first half an hour, you're gonna get in trouble. And like I said, I've avoided
yeah,
it thus far. But I'm getting off topic here. But not on what you had said, because what you said is very
yeah, yeah.
interesting, and I do think it ties back, but just on the question of what you can say and when you can't say it. But yeah, with the question of Syria, I do have to wonder: is this going to be once again the impetus to finally end this last pocket of rebel resistance, this last significant pocket of rebel resistance? And I know that there was hemming and hawing on Trump's part, both during his first term and also with his incoming second term, about the position of the U.S. in Syria and that there was consideration of the U.S. withdrawing. And I think that if this really is the next phase of the wider war in the Middle East, the question of the U.S. withdrawing from Syria is completely off the table. I hate to say it, but it just is. Even if Trump wants to do it, even if he tries to executively do it, it's going. I do think what we saw during his first term, where it just outright flagrant disobedience, is going to be the case again. And although I do think Trump is probably a little more serious this time about some issues, I don't think he's going to have the political capital, even if he wanted to, which is also the big part, to purge some of these more subversive elements from the Pentagon and from the State Department, who derailed at least his um, vision of foreign policy's first term, and that he's not going to touch the kind of people who are going to override him on issues like Syria. And this also gets in the question where the Iranians allegedly delayed their counter attack, however many counters were on,
Hmm.
with this series of salvos that Israel and Iran have fired against each other. But they were expecting another Iranian counterattack in response to the Israeli counterattack, but that has been delayed thus far. Now, if we do
I
get
mean, the
a,
Israeli attack was so pathetic. Like, why even bother?
I mean, you're right. It was,
It's literally not even. It's literally not even worth spending the money on the missiles.
and the Iranians once again have developed, well, has demonstrated, I should say, their missile capability where they can hit anything they want in Israel. That they
Yep.
can bypass the Iron Dome. They can bypass. I hate using this term, but it's officially called David Sling. I hate giving them the gratification of calling their weapon system that, but that's technically what it is called. And with the sorry state of American military industry, it's not going to be replenished, even if they get the Patriots, even if they get the THAAD systems.
How can they get the THAAD systems?
Exactly.
It's got to go to Zelensky.
Yeah. They're gonna duke it out, and it is funny as we saw. Maybe funny is not the right word, but it is quite interesting as we saw with Trump. It seemed like with his transition team, especially his foreign policy team, he was gearing up to shift from Ukraine to the Middle East. And I don't think anyone was expecting anything otherwise. But Biden starts issuing all of these guarantees to Ukraine and giving Ukraine all this aid that he withheld thus far, quote unquote, withheld thus far, forcing the Ukraine
Yeah.
issue back into relevance, derailing Trump and forcing him to be a Ukraine-focused president rather than an Israel-focused president. And I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe that's Biden's last snubbing of Netanyahu, which in which case, like I said, uh, very wicked old man. Don't get me wrong, but it is funny.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like you, I'm skeptical of this idea that he withheld. The fact is, and we've discussed it on the show repeatedly, um, they're just not producing that many. And really, to make an attack, a viable attack, you have to saturate the defender's air defense system, which means you need at least, you need hundreds, or like you definitely need like a bunch. And I think a lot of the withholding was just fake. All it was they needed to collect as many as possible to make an attack that would have a strong effect, right? And like I said, you can't do that unless you can saturate your opponent's system. So, anyways, that's what I think. I think that played just as big a role as hemming and hawing about whether it was viable or not. Like again, they've been attacking Russian Crimea and the Azov Sea area for 2 years with these weapons. Like,
Yes, and the
come on.
legally annexed provinces. The
Hmm.
Because once again, you can talk about Russian territory. According to Russian law, whether you agree or not, the Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea are all Russian territory. Now, you could say the red line was strange. Maybe it was, but that is what they ended up going with, and their actual red line, not the ones that the West has just speculated about and have made up. But it's ultimately it's like the return to the Ukraine issue. Not much is going to change in that regard. That's beyond the fact that the two escalations we're going to get, which we're already seeing, is NATO command centers in Ukraine are going to be fair game. That they're going to take no hesitation in liquidating NATO officers in the country, NATO personnel in the country, and also, if worse comes to worse, they're just going to eviscerate the power grid and uh, force another refugee crisis on Europe. Which,
Yeah. I mean, I know last month I made the comment that if they wanted to stretch Russia, they could attack Syria. But I'm telling you, I didn't think it would happen this year.
and
I,
the manner in which they did it, and things remain to be seen. It's a very developing situation, but this doesn't seem to be the distraction that they bargained for.
right, right. Like, obviously, I don't want to negate, the poor jihadists and Erdogan and the gains that they've made. Also, Putin, he never really prioritized Syria. That's why it's kind of divided as it is. And I suppose, like as we said, wars are planned years in advance. He knew eventually Ukraine would have to be resolved, and that's the pickle he's in right now. So, it was important to liberate Aleppo, to push and give more girth to a safe region for Damascus. And, Latakia. And once that was done, you know, and some of the same problems still persist. Like uh, some of the reports are saying that the Idlib jihadists, we'll just call them that. These guys are, a lot of them are Uzbeks, Chechens, Ugyars.
Turkmen,
They're central
all.
Turkmen. They're they are Central Asiatic Muslims. They're not like, yes, they do have Arabs amongst them from, outside of Syria, but they use drone warfare, and that is what's, there was a counterattack by the Syrian army until the Bayraktars were introduced, and that was like that is what stopped Assad from maybe driving them out of Idlib.
Yes, and I am curious to see what the advancements in drone warfare will look like if Syria does continue to escalate. Because for quite some time, and
Oh, that's what I meant to say. The Assad's forces and the Russians don't have electronic jamming devices. It boggles my mind that after the beginning of the SMO, that's not the case.
I mean, even beforehand, it was Turkish manufactured drones were constantly harassing Latakia. And perhaps we will see advancements rushed to Syria as a result of this recent bout of violence.
Hmm.
But Syria is really where drone warfare, in the sense that we see it today, was pioneered,
Yeah.
and particularly by Turkey and by Turkish-backed groups. And one of the reasons why Armenia suffered the defeat it did against Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, whichever you prefer, I suppose, was because they
Yes.
rejected the integration with Russian air defenses, particularly to deal with Turkish manufactured drones, uh,
Stupid move.
which, once again, the Azeris used Turkish and Israeli drones, which the Russians had ample experience in countering in Syria. And, like, ideally, for the Syrians, we will see a transfer of electronic warfare systems into Syria, of quote unquote cope cages into Syria in order to counter the drone threat. But once again, if they can exploit this gap, if the Idlib jihadists can exploit this gap while it exists, I'm not saying they can win by any means. I'm not saying they'll be in Aleppo by years end by any means, but they can severely set back the Syrian army in that case.
Yeah. Yeah. There were some people that prognosticated back in the summer this year that Syria would flare up again. So there's that. The losses that I've seen that the jihadists have suffered, I mean, anecdotally, yeah, you see groups of them destroyed. Like it hasn't been a success. The amount of success that you might think, it's still unclear. Remember that it's only been 24 hours. Um, Scott from Scott's Calibrated, or Aiden, I guess he's known on Twitter, um, mentioned that a lot of these, even the Turks have told them not to do selfies, right? So a lot of these villages that they rolled into, these are very small units, a dozen men, and doing selfies and shooting up the place, and then retreating. So it's still early. We'll see what Syria comes back with, and the Russians immediately began bombing Apparently, there was one brigade that was bombed. Uh, that I saw footage of a brigade that was, the jihadi. So we'll see.
But I suppose there's only so much speculation we can do on Syria. But
Yeah.
if you did, for a last minute story, want to cover maybe some of the, I guess you could say, troubles with Trump's cabinet picks.
Oh yeah.
Be-
Oh my God.
because thus far, Matt Gaetz is out. He fell under a series of different scandals, and now they've nominated the woman who is currently the Attorney General of Florida, who pretty bog standard conservative, not really anything great or terrible, I suppose. But I think the more interesting story in the context of this show, at least, is the questions over Pete Hegseth, the potential Secretary of Defense.
What a joke.
So, I mean, first off, this guy, his claim to fame, yes, he was a military officer, but his claim to fame is Fox News host, first and foremost. Which, look, given some of the people in the Defense Department, I suppose you could say it's not really that much worse. But I think you could very easily go with anti-establishment picks with somebody who is, say, has a little bit more credibility behind them. Even if you wanted to pull somebody from, I don't know, the media sphere, there's probably somebody better than, I don't know. And I think he wasn't even like a mainstream Fox guy. I think he was like on their online streaming service. And I could be wrong about that. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But of course, as it happens, there's all these accusations of improprieties. But it turns out that uh, while yes, it was an affair, there was no illicit actions on anyone's part. But they've made this guy, and I know that they tried. Oh, he's a white nationalist. Look at all these tattoos he had, and it's the
Oh yeah, they talk about the Jerusalem cross, but they don't talk about the Hebrew letters next to it on his arm.
yes, like of course but that's that's what they always go for. And I'm sure nobody's shocked. They probably thought those were Nazi runes or whatever. They probably could have told the public that, and they would have believed it. But regardless, he's made a fool out of himself. Now I suppose you could say, well, look at the current administration. They haven't made fools out of themselves. Well, yes, they have, admittedly. But if we're to believe that Trump is supposed to be taking a more quote unquote robust direction, I would have expected somebody with a little bit more teeth behind them, somebody who could stand up to scrutiny, and somebody with a little bit more of a record behind them. I don't know, maybe an outspoken critic of it, from the Department of Defense. I don't want to say McGregor because I don't think that he would. I
He
know he
was
worked.
never going to be
No,
chosen
I know that he's worked in the Department
because
of
part
Defense
of Trump's
before.
victory is that the Zionists got behind him.
Yes, yes, and that is it. You can have a Ukraine critic in there, you cannot have an Israel critic in there. That's simply what it is. Uh, and I'm sure whoever Trump picks will match that mold. But I'm I'm not going to say it looks bad for Trump because it doesn't. This is just the simple uh, political nonsense that you get when you get a transition administration, especially with a contentious political figure. But I do think as the nomination process goes on, more of his picks that are, let's just say, quote unquote, less acceptable are probably going to start getting weeded out. And yeah, Tulsi Gabbard for DNI, who, look, yes, does have a mixed record. You can go into her background, whatever. But point being is, if she is the kind of firebrand that I think most people are hoping for, she's probably not going to end up getting the job. That the Senate, that somebody
Yeah.
within Trump's transition team is going to shoot that down. But Rubio, of course, has been met with no issues. Who's shocked by that? That Rubio is seems to be, at least according to the media and to Congress, the least controversial pick. That nobody's tried to dig up anything on him. That they have no problem with him as Secretary of State, which should tell you everything you need to know. Uh, and same with his national security advisor, Mike Waltz. There's been nothing that's come out about him. No, let's just say, unbecoming accusations. And once again, he also fits the mold of the kind of person that you expect there. So I don't want to be like, I know we just had the conversation of are we the optimist pessimists or the pessimistic optimists, but I don't want to be just too doom and gloom on this. However, It's going to get to the point where I think most of Trump's worthwhile cabinet picks, both on domestic and foreign policy issues, are going to start to feel the heat, and that we are going to start to see the compromises take effect early. And will this completely derail the direction of the administration? I can't say that for certain, but uh, my gut tells me that unfortunately, I think that's probably going to be the direction things are going to go in. Is there still some good to be garnered out of this? Will there still be some progress made in our quote unquote direction? Possibly, but let's just say that window closes a little bit every day.
Yes, I mean um when they got rid of Matt Gates, I kind of knew where things were going to go. And I'm going to stick to that. Again, I don't want to black pill some of our listeners. I know they feel like Trump is the last chance, and they need him, and he'll do more good than ill, and all that. But
Well, I would
you
say
know,
yeah, he probably is the last chance, which doesn't bode well for our prospects.
just look at the last chance guy. We'll see what he accomplishes. We'll see. We'll see. I mean, he's not going to have another term. He can do everything he can, but I don't think so. He was awfully quiet. Um, he's got this mandate. The Democrats came short 16 million votes less than when Biden, the most popular president in American history. Um, I mean, the whole thing is laughable, but Trump was very quiet. After the Oreshnika strike, and previously the attack and strike by the and Biden's decision to allow them to strike. Very quiet about that. Very quiet. He was also quiet with Matt Gates. Are you going to tell me that he didn't know Matt Gates was going to have pressure? Like this idea that Matt Gates quit on his own, I simply don't buy it. It's not true. Trump knew that there was going to be a fight, and he backed down. And who they have afterwards, I really don't care, because of all his picks, the only really good solid pick was Matt Gates. Um, and there you have it. So we'll see how it goes.
I mean, as bad as it sounds, because I've made my position on Israel crystal clear. I do hope there's a pivot towards the Middle East on Trump's part, just at least so Ukraine can be wrapped up in a conclusive way that doesn't just kick the can down the road. That isn't this 20-year moratorium on NATO membership, so that we can actually get cohesive peace terms and the departure of Zelensky and the rest of the Maidanites.
I mean, I think that one of the reasons why Trump was not helped in the 2020 election by Zionists is because I think that even with Soleimani's assassination, I don't think they've. I think they were very disappointed with Syria. Um, Netanyahu is still going to want Assad out, and I don't know if Trump can back down, can stand up to Netanyahu. It doesn't seem any American president can. The only thing that has stopped Netanyahu is just the limits of their country and the limits of support. But
Well,
from
maybe
America,
Trump won so Netanyahu can get room and board at Mar-a-Lago.
there you go. But do you know what I mean? I
Yes,
think
yes.
I think I think Netanyahu had big hopes about what was to be done to Syria. Like he had all those crocodile tears for the various attacks, particularly the ones that happened in France. Of course, when it was his own tribesmen that got killed at the Jewish supermarket. But then it was his own people who helped these people recover from their wounds, who were fighting against Assad.
And
Like
I
that's who
love
you
I love
partnered
when that
up
gets
with.
brought up by Zionists, and they talk about Israel is such a moral country that they gave medical aid to terrorists. And it's like, and then they immediately funneled them back into Syria.
Yeah, no, 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 no. They thought they could just tinker and tinker and tinker, and it wouldn't blow up in their, and it did blow up in their face. And so Yeah, I think Netanyahu felt that Trump underperformed. I think he thought like, well, he just lobbed these stupid missiles on the tarmac of an airport that they can repair in 48 hours. That's it. This is it. I think he was hoping, like the U.S. State Department, that you would do a lot more. But and Trump kept repeating that he wanted to take the troops out, and nobody paid attention to him because he's not in charge. Uh, like it's a deal. It's like if there's going to be a deal for the border, it will come down to like destroying Syria and Lebanon and Iran. I don't know if they can do it. You know, we'll see how it goes, but and maybe they won't. Maybe the Ukraine war will still be the war that goes on into 2025. It could very well be that the Ukrainians are going to lower the age limit to 18. I don't know what's going to happen then because honestly, right now it's too late. Like just from a strictly pragmatic point of view, this is something that Ukraine should have done much earlier. They could have started at 20 and up, let's say, so you don't hear the teen ending. So,
And once again, we
um,
as we've seen, they could get away with 18-year-olds illegally.
yes, I know, but
Yeah, I know. I agree that they should have progressively, and this isn't a moral condoning of it, but they should have lowered the conscription age gradually, and then scraped up a little bit illegally as they could, which was
yeah,
what they've been doing so far. But I am surprised that they went from 27 to 25. Now they just want to go to 18, not even like 21, 22. Which I don't know. That might be the compromise, but
yeah, it's because they're winning.
oh yes, of
They're winning
course.
so much that they're going to go down to 18 now.
Yeah, how could I forget? How could I doubt the bravery of the Ukrainian armed forces and their victory? And I mean, I should amend my first statement because as foolish as many of it may have been, a lot of Ukrainians, even these ones who have been conscripted into this, as we discussed earlier in the show, have done their duty honorably, whether or not you agree with it. And I,
Hmm.
I, I will say that they have held out against impossible odds. I mean, look at Bakhmut, look at Adayevka, Ugledar, where they simply were not allowed to retreat. And I mean, you do have to respect it on a certain level, but after a certain point, you have to question what is it for?
Hmm.
And I mean, I think it remains to be seen whether or not we'll actually get the conscription age lowered, but
Yeah, you're right. It might not even happen.
because
Like
they've talked
it
about this
really
before,
might be too late for all of that.
and how much more can they push on the Ukrainian population before general morale breaks down? And also, there's the looming question of how many 18-year-olds are going to be left in the country if the power grid gets eviscerated before winter.
Mm.
Because at that point, I know that they have all the restrictions on who can leave and who can stay. The level of mass exodus towards the border, if there are sustained blackouts throughout the winter, border guards are not going to be able to control that.
Yeah.
It's going to be it is going to be a flood of migrants, and uh, I think, not to condone it, I do not want to see it happen by any means. That's the quickest way Russia could end the war, though.
Hmm.
But once again, that comes at a cost of massive goodwill between them and what remains of Russia's reputation in Ukraine, which is one of the most important things to consider in this war is that they intend to integrate a large part of this country and stand in friendly terms with the parts that they do not integrate. So that those are all things that do need to be considered looking forward into this. And as we discussed with Russia's reputation in Syria, sure that might be the easy solution to just go shock and awe, but you might embitter millions of Ukrainians against you for generations to come. Whereas ideally, you could have these people on your side, and you could
Yeah.
make the Chechen argument that Russia waged two wars against Chechnya now that they're some of their fiercest fighters, but I do think the context is different. The scale of the war is much larger, and that uh, the relationship between the two peoples is of a much different dynamic.
Mm.
But unless you had any last minute stories, I am starting to lose my voice a little.
Okay, yeah, no, that's it for me too.
So thank you everyone for tuning in once again to this special holiday weekend edition of the War Report.
Yeah,
Uh,
happy Thanksgiving,
yes,
guys.
certainly happy Thanksgiving. I hope everyone has enjoyed themselves, and you'll be hearing more from us relatively soon. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.